To a four-year high over the summer, Chancellor Rishi Sunak faces questions over the timing of his furlough scheme extension. 20 seconds to go then until the start of the European equity trading session. Futures do look to be pointing to the downside. Euro Stoxx 50 futures fairly flat, as are FTSE futures, but DAX futures suggest a little bit of downside to come. Yesterday, we saw such stellar gains for equity markets, real repositioning around some of the more recent momentum trade, around some of the value names, around the growth names as well, of course. And as a result of that, perhaps we are pausing for thought and maybe with a little bit of a downside bias this morning in that pause. This is what the GMM function looks like then as we open up these European equity markets for you this morning. We have a fairly flat picture on the FTSE 100 at the very start of the trading day, but we'll wait for the CAC and the DAX to add into the mix and get a fuller picture of what is happening across these markets. Of course, it is really good news what we've heard on the vaccine, but as the time has gone on and more people have had time to digest what it is that Pfizer and BioNTech have announced, a few people with questions. We'll get into some of those questions in just a moment. But let's remind ourselves of the strong gains we made in yesterday's session. If you're Rolls-Royce, if you're IAG, if you're a food delivery business, then you saw big increases or decreases, huge volatility in share prices as of yesterday, as we saw some of the work from home bets unwound, as we saw some of the caution around the leisure sector unwound. There's possibly still more to come of that. We'll talk to an investor shortly and find out whether they would agree with that sentiment. But this is where we are at the moment, with the CAC and the DAX actually not open just yet, but the IBEX and the FTSE MIB actually fairly flat. So we'll wait to see if we get some more downside coming through when the CAC and the DAX open. I should say US futures are fairly mixed, fairly flat in their entirety. Now, European markets opening slightly higher. That's after Pfizer and BioNTech made a breakthrough in their development of a coronavirus vaccine. But world leaders warned people to be cautious over the immediate outlook.
I must stress that these are very, very early days.
It's clear that this vaccine, even if approved, will not be widely available for many months yet to come.
We absolutely cannot rely on this news as a solution, and the biggest mistake we could make now would be to slacken our resolve at a critical moment.
We're still facing a very dark winter.
Joining us now is Kurt Custard, Newton Investment Management's CIO. Kurt, very good to speak to you. So we saw in yesterday's session a big rotation. We were looking at the factors to watch function on the Bloomberg, showed selling of momentum stocks, selling of growth stocks, going instead into value. What is it that you think is going to be sustained from the moves that we saw of yesterday?
Well, I think the value trade is a really interesting one because obviously growth stocks have outperformed value for a really long time. And in fact, that spread is probably as wide as it's ever been. So I wouldn't be surprised as we go into a more muddled economic environment that value starts to begin to reassert themselves. That said, on the long-term trend, a lot of these tech names have been reinforced by the pandemic and the shift in consumer behaviors. And it wouldn't, if you have a 5 or 10 year view, it's hard to bet against tech here.
Right, that's interesting. That's important context, isn't it? As we see the Nasdaq under pressure right now in the most sort of immediate sessions. What about values prospects then? How do you navigate that pickup in demand for value stocks then through the winter, Kurt, where we might be constantly reminded of how we don't have a vaccine just yet, and the virus is with us. The virus is still creating this need for lockdown measures of various sorts, certainly across Europe.
Well, I think yesterday the S&P was really indicative. I mean, you saw effectively the S&P retrace all of its losses on the back of the news. We're back at highs now, and the reality is the economy hasn't caught up to it. All right, the equity market's been front running the real economy now for almost a year, and we're going to still see sort of a muddled economic growth as the real economy begins to recover from the pandemic. So I am absolutely, like everyone else, relieved to hear the news about the vaccine. It's very preliminary, but certainly is pointing in the right direction. That said, yesterday's rally to me feels a lot like it's a genuine, I mean this in the emotional sense, a relief rally. We're glad to see the end of what has been a really, really dark period of time. So, I look forward, and as a rational investor, I'm trying to say, okay, well, the real economy isn't necessarily there yet. But the stock market is front running it a little bit.
Front running it a little. That's interesting. I mean, what this means for humanity, of course, is on the forefront, at the forefront of everybody's minds, and it does seem to be an incredible step forward, even if not the end of the story. We just put up the factors to watch, which showed which factors had been surging in yesterday's session in the US, and I noticed that dividend-paying stocks were high up there. Do you think that is going to be something that in 2021 we are able to return to, talking about how companies are able to return money to shareholders in a more sort of generous fashion once again?
Yeah, I think so. I think people are going to start to look back to fundamentals, look at companies with really sound business models, and those business models, especially for mature companies, are often manifested in the form of dividends. So companies that are able to navigate the relatively uncertain economic environment going forward should rally here. We're seeing an end to the concern, I think, of massive sort of national level lockdowns outside of here in the UK. Those should diminish through time, which means companies should be able to get on sounder economic footing, which in turn means they'll be able to pay dividends. So that rally makes a lot of sense to me.
And what about in the fixed income markets? I was looking at junk bonds. I mean, we were seeing the impact of this vaccine on markets everywhere, weren't we? The news flow was hitting the markets and doing what it does. Let me talk to you about junk bond yields, because they hit a record low in yesterday's session. They weren't all that high, perhaps, given the amount of central bank support that was forthcoming in the US and in Europe for companies. But are you less concerned now, then, about balance sheets, about the integrity of balance sheets as we move through the winter?
That's a great question. I mean, I think the trade-off here is really the pace of economic growth versus the degree of central monetary policy support. As you pointed out, monetary policy has been massively supportive for fixed income going forward. I expect out of the statements of the Fed and other central bankers that we're likely to see continued support out of monetary policy on a go-forward basis, which should cap any rise in yield. That said, much like the equity market, I think, has rallied sort of ahead of the real economic news, I think the fixed income markets and the junk bond market has done the same.
And what about the fiscal stimulus side of things, Kurt? 6 minutes into our conversation or so, and we haven't yet talked about the US election. What are you reading in the detail of the US election, the win for President-elect Biden, but also the tie so far in the Senate that might have to wait till January to be unwound? What are you reading from that result into the fiscal story?
Well, I think so. The bottom line is a divided government is typically pretty good for markets because it keeps government policy from swinging too extremely in either direction, and the markets love stability, and a divided government gives that. If the Democrats were to take the Senate after the runoffs in Georgia, I think that would probably presage a pretty substantial economic package coming through. I think both the fiscal and monetary policy side are likely to err on the side of being hotter versus colder in terms of policy stimulus. And I think under a Biden administration, you're likely to see more of that. I think the tilt will be probably towards more green infrastructure in that environment, which I think is important from a thematic perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. That links nicely into our next conversation, Kurt. Thank you very much, Kurt Custard. Stay with us. Newton Investment Management CIO. Coming up, going for green. Could common climate change goals bring the US and the UK closer? We'll bring you more of our exclusive conversation with the UK's Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to the European Market Open. Just coming up to 11 minutes into our trading session here in Europe. Stocks, Europe 600, fairly flat actually. Travel and leisure stocks continue some of the rebound that we saw of yesterday. The banking sector flat. Technology under pressure, down by 0.75%, as you can see. So a little bit of a continuation actually of some of the rotation that we saw sector-wise in yesterday's session, just not to the same degree, not to the same extremes. Now, the UK Chancellor of the Exchequer is making green innovation the centrepiece of his vision for Britain's financial services future as he looks to overhaul that sector. He spoke exclusively to Guy Johnson about his plan.
We want to remain one of the most open places to do business anywhere in the world. We want to be on the leading edge of technological adoption. And importantly, we want to be a leader in green finance. So today we announced we will be issuing a green sovereign bond for the first time next year, and being, I think, the first major economy to mandate the climate disclosures across the economy by 2025. I think taken together, it cements our position of wanting to be a global leader on these issues.
Okay, let's dig into that, because there's a lot in there already. Let's talk a little bit about what's happening with the gilt market. So we are going to see next year green gilts being issued. How is a regular gilt going to differ from a green gilt? Do you think that green gilt should have a yield premium, trade at a higher premium, for example, to regular gilts? And how will investors ensure that the promises that are made as part of those green gilts are actually delivered upon?
Yeah. Well, we've been watching this market for a while to make sure that it was the right thing to do. And I think what we've been now convinced of, looking at the market experience, is a couple of things. One is, obviously we can make sure that the proceeds go to the areas and the types of things that people will expect them to. There's essentially an existing framework we can use to deploy, as other countries have for that. But to the point on pricing, I think what's clear looking at the market is what green gilts do is bring in a new class of investor as well. And we are now seeing repeated issuances of sovereign green bonds, which trade at tighter spreads to existing gilts, I think partly driven by different investors coming in. Now, I think that's something we want to tap into. The other benefit of launching a sovereign curve is that it means that private companies then have the ability to piggyback on that, and it will help grow a private green market in the UK and give UK investors also access to more GBP denominated bonds, where currently they might have to invest in green bonds in different currencies. So I think there's a lot of other things that issuing the green sovereign bond will help catalyse.
But you think there will be a high yield for a green bond, and do you think that spread will eventually compress down to virtually nothing?
Yeah, look, we'll have, markets are markets, and markets will price what they want to do. I think what we're seeing, the experience of other countries now, is that there are green issues that trade at a tighter spread. It's obviously going to vary as to where you are and what market demand is at the appropriate time. But that's something that we've been watching. But I think, as I said, the interesting thing is what else it catalyses. So once you can start creating that sovereign green bond market, that will help private participants also issue green bonds, make sure there's more GBP-oriented liquidity in that market. All of that is great for what we're trying to do here. What are we trying to do? We're trying to attract capital into funding projects that will help us meet our ambitions on net zero, and this will be an important part of that.
We now look as if we're going to have a Joe Biden presidency in the United States. The Prime Minister asked about this over the weekend, talked about the fact that there is more that unites us than divides us. Do you worry that calculation has now changed? The Prime Minister had a very close relationship with Donald Trump. Do you think this will make life difficult for the UK on the trade front? Do you think it will make a trade deal less likely?
No, first of all, enormous congratulations to President-elect Biden and Kamala Harris. As a dad of 2 little girls, I think fantastic to see first female vice president in the United States, for the signal that will send and the inspiration that it provides. And I agree with the PM. There's so much that unites our 2 countries. Obviously, it's a place that I've lived and worked for many years myself. Climate change is something I would put at the top of that list. The announcements I made today about the UK wanting to show global leadership and progress the climate change agenda when it comes to financial services. Hopefully that's something that we can work very closely on. It's something that President-elect Biden spoke about a lot during the campaign. So I remain very optimistic and excited about the relationship that we will have with the new administration.
UK Chancellor of the Exchequer Rishi Sunak speaking exclusively to our colleague Guy Johnson. Interesting conversation there around green gilts. This is what markets look like for you right now. We've got modest gains coming through on European equity markets. In fact, no, Stocks Europe 600 now just into negative territory, down 0.2%. The FTSE is flat, but we see a little bit more downside coming through in Germany. The pound also makes some slight gains despite more gloomy news on jobs. The pound up around 0.25%. Kurt Custard, Newton Investment Management CIO, is still with us. Kurt, we heard there the Chancellor Rishi Sunak talking a lot about green gilts. How much more convinced are you around investing around climate change themes now that we are going to have a Democratic president, we're going to have President Biden from next year? How much has that convinced you in the climate change direction, if you needed convincing?
Well, I certainly not going to hurt. Clearly, there's been a split in opinion between the Republicans and Democrats on the importance and how to tackle climate change. That said, I think a lot of people focus too much a little bit at the federal level. The reality is the states in the United States hold a tremendous amount of power, and a lot of states have maintained their alignment with the Paris Accord throughout the Trump administration. I would expect at the federal level we're going to re-sign the accord under a Biden administration. And I think that you can make a very strong case that to tackle the challenges, which are going to be global in nature, you're going to need innovation. You're going to need commercial exploitation of the opportunity set that's out there for, that is accorded us effectively by climate change, and there's a huge profit to be able to be made here. So I'm pretty hopeful. I think climate change is one of our big themes. I think it's going to persist for the next decade, and I think if you get on the right side of it, you make a lot of money.
We talked a little earlier to Bill Winters of Standard Chartered, who also chairs the task force on scaling voluntary carbon markets. Do you think is that something that's caught your attention? Are voluntary carbon markets part of the solution, part of enabling businesses to reduce emissions, essentially?
Yeah, I think a combination of a carbon market plus the right regulatory environment will obviously spur a change in behavior. But clearly, I think that there is a public pressure in this space. There is a very simple commercial pressure in this space. So, I'm hopeful that as a carbon market develops, or even independent of that carbon market, you're going to see a lot of companies sort of change their behavior. A carbon market is going to have to be genuinely a market, though, worthwhile for it to be successful for investors like ourselves to start to be able to play in size.
You talked in our last conversation about how you wouldn't draw too many conclusions about tech from what happened yesterday, and still tech is here to stay, as if that ever needed saying. What about those online work from home stocks then? Where do you think the focus goes for them as we start to look at what life might be like, many fingers and toes crossed, post pandemic?
Well, what we're seeing is we're seeing the pandemic accelerated a change, right? And you're going to get some mean reversion from that acceleration. So as the world exits the pandemic environment, you're going to see people going back to their local main streets and their high streets, et cetera, to be able to do their shopping because it's different, it's new, it's what they know, right? And I would expect that to continue to occur. However, the behaviors that we've learned under the pandemic are also likely to persist. And so it'll be a blend of the world. Right, we're not going to see exclusive online shopping, but we're also not going to see a return to the main street of old. When we surveyed our employees about how often after the pandemic, after there's a vaccine, do they want to go back to the office, we're having roughly between a 60 and 80% expected return rate, which means that our footprint is going to shrink, which means it's going to impact, if we're representative of a lot of companies, it's going to impact everything from telecommunication sales on a sort of a permanent basis to the commercial property development in the city centers. So I do think there's going to be a structural change in behavior. It's just we're going to see a rebound to what was normal first.
Yeah, interesting stuff. Thanks so much, Kurt. Thanks for your time. Kurt Custard, Newton Investment Management's CIO.
Thank you.
And Kurt will be continuing his conversation with me on Bloomberg Radio at 9 a.m. UK time. Let's get a Bloomberg Business Flash. For that, here's Laura Wright. Laura.
Thanks, Anna. ThyssenKrupp is in talks with the German government for 5 billion euros in aid for its steel unit. That well exceeds the group's current market value. Berlin has signaled willingness to provide support to shore up the business. It may be about 2 billion euros in liquidity and 3 billion in grants. Bayer may face as many as 4 US trials over its Roundup weed killer next year. That's after a judge said he is ready to resume putting cases in front of jurors. Bayer says it settled or reached general agreements for over 88,000 claims its herbicide causes cancer, but there are still thousands unresolved. Adidas is returning to growth in Europe after a prolonged slump in the region. Demand picked up for sneakers and casual wear across the continent during the summer months, but it's less positive around the rest of the world. North America showed a slight decline in sales, and business in Asia slowed down even more. That's your Bloomberg Business Flash. Anna.
Thanks very much, Laura. Laura Wright here in London with your Business Flash. European equity markets now positive. We're seeing a little bit of volatility. Market's not really sure which way they're heading this morning, but something's turned things around. US futures pointing higher as well. Stock 600 up by 0.2%. The FTSE up 0.5%. Even the Zeshu DAX has dragged itself up to flat territory. And as I say, US futures do now point to the upside. Coming up, cheap and cheerful, investor euphoria over a vaccine breakthrough sends value stocks surging relative to their faster growing peers. Is a full rotation in the works? We saw some yesterday. Is that continuing today? We discuss next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to the European market open 24 minutes into the trading session. European stocks moving to the upside, up 0.4%. Interesting to see a continuation of yesterday's theme then. So travel and leisure stocks pushing higher just modestly compared to yesterday, and same with technology stocks to the downside, but again modestly compared to yesterday, but still fairly substantial moves. Progress toward a COVID-19 vaccine pushed investors into the most unloved stocks, and momentum names were punished. It gave value investors a glimmer of hope amid a trade that's long suffered as big cap tech gets all of the attention. Joining us now is Danny Berger with analysis of what happened yesterday, Danny, and also what this means then as we go into the winter. Was yesterday a decisive rotation into value, or just a glimpse of something that could happen?
At this moment, Anna, it definitely seems like a glimpse. And I would almost argue that this was more of a momentum crash than a move into value. And look, we're certainly seeing that continue today. The sectors you pointed out, momentum continuing to fall as value does a little bit better. But just to revisit some of the market action yesterday, looking at FTW, factors to watch on your terminal, you can see momentum fell 14.5% yesterday. This is a massive drop. If you want to find where value falls on this board, it's not even the top performing factor. It's the third down. It went up by more than 5.5%. So really it was all about these tech names, which has really been the old reliable trade of the pandemic, this trade where they have stronger balance sheets and can somewhat survive the effects of the work from home trader, benefit from it. That has started to been unwound. We'll see if that continues. But look, I want to switch up the boards and show you a tweet, because even the biggest quants, this is Cliff Asness, and his strategy relies on value. So if you think there's a value cheerleader out there, it will be him, the AQR founder. Regarding momentum, he says, yep, sadly, that is much bigger today in terms of the momentum rotation. Though can happen at turning points in the market, that's what momentum bets against. So hopefully this is one. I should point out, Cliff Asness says that he's been playing Doom Eternal on ultra violence level, the video game, because he finds it soothing during these market times. And look, there's also question, if this is the start, can it continue? I want to bring Michael Purvis into the question from Talbot. And I love quoting him because he really looks at volatility. The VIX is stubbornly high. A lot of issues that may not prompt this rotation, Anna.
Danny, interesting stuff. Thanks very much. Danny Berger on the question of whether we continue to see that rotation then into value. More on the markets when we return. European equity markets then are making modest gains today. Stock 600 up 0.25%. This is Bloomberg.
I must stress that these are very, very early days.
It's clear that this vaccine, even if approved, will not be widely available for many months yet to come.
We absolutely cannot rely on this news as a solution, and the biggest mistake we could make now would be to slacken our resolve at a critical moment.
We're still facing a very dark winter.
That was President-elect Joe Biden and British Prime Minister Boris Johnson warning the public about a tough winter ahead despite the promising vaccine news. This is the picture on stocks this morning. Stocks Europe 600 up by 0.2%. It seems that markets are divided. We've seen a lot of moving up and down this morning around the flat line in either direction. Not entirely sure whether markets are convinced that this is great vaccine. Well, yesterday we were very convinced, of course, about the great vaccine news, but now perhaps a sense that people are more concerned around distribution, around efficacy, around a mutation of the virus in mink in Denmark, all of that very much part of the conversation as well. So markets deciding whether they have any intention of pushing stocks higher, pushing risk assets higher in the way that they did yesterday. Let's get a Bloomberg First Word News update, and for that, here's Laura Wright.
Thanks, Anna. President Donald Trump has fired Defense Secretary Mark Esper. The relationship had soured in recent months. That's after he resisted the president deciding against using active duty forces to quell protests across the US. Esper's departure could foreshadow a broader post-election shakeup. The president has named Christopher Miller as acting Pentagon chief. The UK's House of Lords has rejected government plans to break international law over Brexit. Peers voted to remove the most controversial parts of the bill, which have prompted legal action from the EU. But Prime Minister Boris Johnson is refusing to back down, vowing to push ahead with the new law. The unelected House of Lords can only delay legislation, not block it. The European Union is imposing tariffs on $4 billion of US goods starting today. It's part of the tit-for-tat escalation in the fight over illegal aid to aircraft manufacturers Boeing and Airbus. Goods hit include spirits, nuts, tractors and video games. The EU says it will drop the duties if the US removes levies it imposed in 2019. Armenia's prime minister says he's signed an agreement to end the war over Nagorno-Karabakh. It comes just days after Azerbaijan captured a key strategic city in the contested region. Russian President Vladimir Putin says the agreement will be the basis for long-term stability in the war-torn region. The Federal Reserve is warning assets face big declines if the virus goes unchecked. According to the Fed's financial stability report, most assets have maintained strong levels so far. That's as investor appetite increased and the government intervened to support the financial system. But signs of weakness are showing in commercial real estate. Global news 24 hours a day on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. This is Bloomberg. Anna.
Thanks very much, Laura. Laura Wright in London. Market's taking a little while to settle down this morning into a sort of stable narrative. The stock 600 up just 0.1% now. The FTSE 100 does seem to be doing pretty well, up 0.6%. But the Xetra DAX over in Germany down by around 0.3%. It's interesting to see that the market seems to remain convinced that technology is not where you want to be right now. So the technology stocks down by 1.6%. Travel and leisure, yes, they're up 0.5%, but off highs we saw earlier on in the session. Instead, banks moving to the upside, so banks up by 1.5%. Perhaps that is one of the reasons that we are seeing a better performance in the London market, given the weighting towards that particular sector. Now, the European Union will impose tariffs on $4 billion of US goods starting today. The move is a tit-for-tat escalation of a transatlantic fight over illegal aid to Boeing and Airbus. European Commissioner for Trade, Valdis Dombrovskis, says the tariffs have nothing to do with Joe Biden's victory.
A decision related to tariffs in Boeing case is not linked with U.S. elections. It's linked with the fact that WTO has given us the award for $4 billion and linked with our internal procedures.
Joining us now, Bloomberg's Maria Tadeo, she's in Brussels with Werner Hoyer, European Investment Bank President. Maria.
That's right. Well, good morning. And we are joined indeed by the president of the European Investment Bank, Mr. Hoyer. I really have to ask you for your take on the European economy before we move on to anything else. Yesterday, there was huge euphoria in markets because of the vaccine. Today, it does seem that the market has taken a step back to really reassess what's happening. And we have coronavirus still very much coming into play. So do you think we can avoid a double-dip recession or not?
That's not that easy to be answered. The fact, however, is that since yesterday we see light at the end of the tunnel, and that is not the train coming the other way. It is real light and hope. And therefore, it was not a surprise that the stock markets yesterday reacted so strongly, and that a little bit it was seen as an overdose. So I think we are going into rational developments in the next hours and days.
Right, but are you more optimistic at this point, or would you say the uncertainty really remains? I mean, I know you mentioned the vaccine is great news, and it really is great news. Has been done very quickly, but when it comes to the visibility over the next 6 months, it does seem like it's still very clouded.
Well, so, but imagine that this vaccine would not appear at the horizon now. So it gives hope, and I think it will have a trigger-on effect on other parts of the economy. And from that point of view, I'm really optimistic. It was the game changer which we so urgently needed. And we, as EIB, we are very proud because
and is that going to feed? And I guess, go ahead.
We are just so proud because we had detected more or less this development with biotech, and we were the first ones to commit to that company. And I think it's really good news and encouraging for our own people to see that obviously we have the capacity to discover these treasures.
Right, and that was my next question. You know, just the idea, the promise that a vaccine could be coming in the short term, is that going to feed through real investment in Europe? We know that's declined. We know that companies have been worried about taking on that investment, investing looking forward because of the uncertainty. Do you think that could feed into the real economy in any way?
I definitely hope so, because the development of investment activities over the last month was really disquieting. And sometimes people were acting in a not necessarily rational way, because everybody in our opinion polls tells us the weakest part of our development is investment activity. And then if you ask the big companies or the small companies, whoever, where do you cut the first? Then it is very often it's that, well, we need to cut on investment. And that is, of course, something that worries me a lot. We need to invest into modernization, into new technologies, into development. And I think with a beacon of hope like BioNTech and Pfizer, now there is an encouragement to go back into investment, into modernization.
Right, and if you look at the rally that we saw yesterday, one part of it, of course, was led by the vaccine. The other one was led by this idea, particularly here in Europe, that the European budget talks are finally moving and that we could get a deal in the next few days. If we do get this European budget, if the recovery fund goes ahead, I do wonder, how is that going to affect you? How is that going to affect the flow of money to countries that need it? And do you actually see a feasible pickup in investment in the second half of the next year?
I'm very optimistic that that will take place. The conclusion of the budget negotiations are.
It gets done this week?
I'm not involved in this.
It gets done this week? Is that what you hear?
I think we are very, very, very close. And this is important for us as well, because we cooperate so closely with the European Union and in particular with the European Commission, that for our business planning, it's important to have this stalemate broken.
And can I just ask you, you know, when you look at specifically the recovery fund, and we know that's been driving markets higher for a while now, and it's kept those yields very low, you know, I do wonder, there are countries that have already hinted, I am interested in the grants, but not so much on the loans. I'm not so interested in the credit. Is that a good idea, to just tap the grants and forget about the credit line?
Well, of course, as a banker, I'm interested in giving out loans. So I see that the necessity to come up also with grant support was given. Whether the balance is right or not, it's not my business to decide. I'm quite sure that the needs for financing of investment in particular in the next months will be so enormous that in addition to these grants given by the European Union, a lot of investment, a lot of loan activity will be necessary in order to get the machine rolling.
So I do wonder, you know, if you look at a country like Italy, how are you going to convince them to do that? Because it does seem that politically this is not going to fly. There's still a stigma when it comes to loans in Europe, and potentially they would rather not spend as much, but just keep it grant. So how are you going to make a case?
I think as far as EIB is concerned, we have a very good record because we are a bank to a large extent driven by engineers and by science. And that means that people see, investors see that if we go into an investment with a specific company or branch, then this is going to be a good investment and others will follow to finance. So for our business, this is not an impediment.
And just as a very final question, you could argue the final element that we need in Europe this year to kind of just seal it is that Brexit deal. I do wonder, what do you hear? Do you hear from all of the European officials that I'm sure you're on the phone with that a deal is more likely now than it was a week ago?
Well, this is a Mikado situation.
So I have to ask you.
This is a Mikado situation. Whoever moves first has lost. So we are going to see that the game being continued until the very, very end. But in addition to this Brexit uncertainty, we have now a huge opportunity with the outcome of the US elections and the hope that transatlantic relations can be restored, and what I count on.
Well, Mr. Hoyer, thank you so much for your time. Always a pleasure having you here on Bloomberg Television. Anna?
Thanks very much. Thanks to Werner Hoyer, European Investment Bank President. Thanks to Maria Tadeo then joining us there from Brussels. Quick check on the markets then for you. This is what we have for you on the equity markets right now. Stocks Europe 600 down now, down 0.2%. The banking sector remains one bright spot. The Xetra DAX seems to be the market that is succumbing to the downside. Delivery Hero down another 7% this today. No surprise there. Perhaps we know that tech story. Adidas, a slightly heavier weighting, of course, down by 3%, and that seems to be moving things around this morning. Deutsche Bank also, Deutsche Bank actually moving to the upside in today's session. Up next, a fresh start. European leaders reach out to President-elect Joe Biden, seeking to rebuild transatlantic ties after a tumultuous 4 years. We'll discuss those transatlantic bonds. This is Bloomberg.
have the system in place to consider concerns, and President Trump is 100% within his rights to look into allegations of irregularities and weigh his legal options.
That was Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell saying President Trump is within his rights to challenge the election results. European leaders have reached out to President-elect Joe Biden seeking to rebuild transatlantic ties after a tumultuous 4 years of dealing with the Trump administration. But France's Bruno Le Maire warned that Europe should not drop its guard. Writing in a French newspaper, he said, "Let's not kid ourselves. The geopolitical realities will not change. The US remains in confrontation with China, and Europe must therefore assert its economic and political sovereignty." Let's speak now with Justin Weiss, who's the founder and director general of the Paris Peace Forum. The conference, a meeting place for business leaders and policymakers across the world, is now in its third edition, and they're going to get underway with that third meeting tomorrow, I understand. Justin, thank you very much for joining us. Do you agree with Le Maire's assessment there then that the geopolitical realities in terms of the relationships between China and the US and therefore Europe as well will not change as a result of President Biden?
I do agree with that statement, but you know, still there will be a lot of change. There will be a lot of change because the lens through which the American administration will see the world starting January 20th will be one of cooperation and stronger transatlantic ties rather than one of competition, of unilateralism, as we've seen during the past 4 years, with considerable damage for things like climate, trade, or other global challenges.
Do you think then the liberal world order, so rattled by Brexit, by President Trump, by the actions of Russia, are we at a turning point then with a Biden presidency?
Well, you know, the deterioration of that liberal world order had started before Trump. Trump, and I would say COVID-19, simply accelerated that deterioration, which we had seen before, and which is due to factors like great power competition, like, populist leaders undermining multilateralism, etc. And it will be good to have a Biden administration for sure, but there are limits to that. There are limits because the US will defend its interest, and it's normal that it would do so. It would do so more collaboratively, but it will still do so. And we will still have to try and remedy that lack of international coordination. And that's why the Paris Peace Forum is all about.
Right, and so when you look at the role that international multilateral organisations, and yours is one of them, but there are plenty, of course, what role they can still play. I mean, President Trump has somewhat successfully shone a light on some of the inadequacies of those organisations, whether it's around NATO and funding, or the influence of one country in the WHO, or rows that get stuck for years at the WTO. Do you get a sense that some of these multilateral organisations will struggle to still find relevance?
Well, you know, I would dispute the depiction of what Trump has done, because to a large extent he has either fought against these organizations, leaving the Paris Agreement, for example, leaving the WHO, rather than trying to change them and trying to reinvest American power and inject American substance into them, leaving a large free space for China. And so that was, I think, a lose-lose proposition, weakening the rules of the game and the institutions that serve us well, A, and B, leaving some more space for others. And so my hope is that by re-injecting American cooperation into the WHO, for example, or into the UN, Biden will be able to make a difference and to make them more effective and more efficient. Both things are necessary.
How does the liberal world order, though, deal with the fact that we still have a tension between the US and China, and many people suggest that that will continue to be the case? It'll be difficult for Europe to find its place in that bifurcation of the world.
It's true that the world order suffers from that competition, as it had suffered a lot from the Cold War and the USSR competition. Europe has shown that it could assert its voice in some domains, like trade, like regulation, etc. Of course, the danger is one of anesthesia. That is to say that it's much more comfy to be with Biden administration and the Trump administration, which forced Europeans to sort of get back on their heels and increase their strategic autonomy. With Biden, because we will cooperate more and it's good, of course there will be less incentive to push on that button of European independence and autonomy. But still, Europe should do that for the sake of the liberal world order, precisely.
Thanks very much, Justin. Really good to speak to you. Justin Weiss, the founder and director general of the Paris Peace Forum, that gets underway in its third edition, its third year. That gets underway this week in Paris. Let's look at markets for you then. NASDAQ futures. Of course, we had a tough time on the NASDAQ yesterday. It wasn't difficult to see why investors decided to sell some of those NASDAQ stocks that had done so well, some of those tech stocks. And it looks as if we could see a continuation of that today. Euro-dollar is at 118.38, 10-year yield. A big surge in the yield, selling of fixed income, piling into risk assets. That was the theme of yesterday, 92 basis points there. Oil, 40.65 on NYMEX. Up next, which asset does best on vaccine approval? Is it all about engine manufacturers and aviation? We'll put that question to Markets Live. Christine Aquino, she joins us next. This is Bloomberg.
Governments have been at this for decades. And while we made some good progress, there have been some good initiatives and some good schemes, it's not enough. We're not on track to hit the net zero by 2050, which is what's required to keep our climate change to under 1.5 degrees. The private markets have stepped in to do their own thing.
Welcome back to the programme. That was Standard Chartered CEO Bill Winters speaking to me earlier on in the programme. European banks gaining 14% in 2 days, and a little bit more of a gain coming in today's session, but a lot of that of yesterday, of course, with that move into some of the value names. Let's get to Christine Aquino, who leads our Markets Live team here in Europe. And Christine, I know the question you've been asking on the blog today is which asset does best on vaccine approval? I was looking at the Rolls-Royce share price. That seemed to be a contender in yesterday's session, at least. What were you hearing?
Yeah, I mean, just before I came on, we were actually debating which stocks would benefit from this vaccine story. And of course, one of them is the sectors that are in the supply chain of vaccine distribution, which is refrigeration companies. And I think this just speaks to the thought process now that must be going on among investors' minds of now that we have this stage of the pandemic, the vaccine stage, or the potential for a vaccine, right? The question then would be what companies would be benefiting from that. I mean, again, thinking about the supply chain of the vaccines, it's not just the vaccine providers themselves, but every company involved in that stage has potential to do well. Very similarly to what we saw earlier this year when people were contemplating which stocks were going to be benefiting from the work from home era, thus the big tech's resurgence this year. And we could see something similar for any companies in that vaccine supply chain.
It's interesting to think about the earnings story right now, Christine, isn't it? I mean, it seems a little disjointed given the fact we get these big moments in time which make such a difference, whether that's the presidential election or news around vaccines, and suddenly all things change. Let me ask you about the earnings season and what you're reflecting on then, because I know you've been giving some thought to how the UK did during September.
Yeah, absolutely, Anna. I think mostly what we've been looking for in terms of the earnings stories is longevity. Any sign of companies being able to derive sustainable profits, not just from the current situation. I know that it has created a bit of bifurcation between different sectors depending on whether they are benefiting from this current pandemic / work from home setup or were they being hurt by it. But looking forward to the future, what sources of revenue can they really draw upon? And does that look sustainable given the current setup?
Okay, thanks so much. Thanks very much, Christine, for joining us. Christine Aquino, who joins our Markets Live team here in Europe. That's it for a fairly mixed open to the European equity trading session. Surveillance is next.
Market euphoria over a vaccine stalls. There's concern Pfizer's study still has hurdles to clear. President-elect Joe Biden warns of a tough winter ahead. Pandemic warning, the Fed says there could be major downsides for asset prices if the economic impact of the virus isn't mitigated. And Trump continues his fight to overturn the election results. Attorney General Barr authorizes the DOJ to open investigations while acknowledging there is no conclusive evidence of fraud. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. A lot of focus, of course, is on the markets. We saw a bit of whipsawing since the euphoria that we saw yesterday on the back of that vaccine that was very promising from Pfizer and BioNTech. So let's get straight to the markets and give you an idea of what they're doing this Tuesday morning. Now, the focus, of course, is on gold. The focus is also on other things, for example, such as European stocks in general. So you see, we had a muted response this morning. Again, I'm excited to speak to our Sam Fazeli about the vaccine euphoria and actually some of the hurdles ahead. So I don't know whether this repricing is maybe a little bit of profit taking after the rally that we saw in the last 2 days, or whether there are real questions about the vaccine. That's probably the question of the day when it comes to markets. Now let's get straight to the Bloomberg. First word news here in London is Laura Wright. Hi, Laura.
Good morning, Francine. The European Union is imposing tariffs on $4 billion of US goods starting today. It's part of the tit-for-tat escalation in the fight over illegal aid to aircraft manufacturers Boeing and Airbus. Goods hit include spirits, nuts, tractors and video games. The EU says it will drop the duties if the US removes levies it imposed back in 2019. The UK's House of Lords has rejected government plans to break international law over Brexit. Peers voted to remove the most controversial parts of the bill, which have prompted legal action from the EU. But Prime Minister Boris Johnson is refusing to back down, vowing to push ahead with the new law. The unelected House of Lords can only delay legislation, not block it. President Donald Trump has fired Defense Secretary Mark Esper. The relationship had soured in recent months. That's after he resisted the president, deciding against using active duty forces to quell protests across the US. Esper's departure could foreshadow a broader post-election shakeup. The president has named Christopher Miller as acting Pentagon chief. Global news 24 hours a day on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. This is Bloomberg. Francine.
Laura, thanks so much. Now, results of a COVID-19 vaccine trial from Pfizer and BioNTech are fueling optimism that the world will soon have a way out of the pandemic. Experts, though, are cautioning that the shot still has many hurdles to clear. There are questions about production and distribution, as well as how much and for how long the vaccine will actually protect you. Well, joining us now is Sam Fazeli, who leads our pharma coverage for Bloomberg Intelligence. Sam, always great to speak to you. Do you have concerns that the market were too optimistic on how quickly and how viable this vaccine is?
Good morning, Francine. I'm not going to say that the market was overblown or not overblown. I don't think it's abnormal that we've had a massive party after all we've had to deal with was increasing cases and worries about how we can get out of this conundrum that we've got ourselves into. So, but there's no question that this is only the first step. You know, we've only going to the moon and back. We've only fired the rocket so far. So that's the key thing to remember. There's a lot of other things that have to happen yet.
But this was a successful launch. If we're going to go down the rocket analogy, Sam, and what kind of, you see, the problem is that you're a virologist. I'm not, Sam. The market isn't. A lot of people watching are not virologists. So if you have a good response in 90% of the people, does it mean that we could really have a vaccine? Or is the longevity of these antibodies the main concern that you would have?
So the concern is not the right phrase. I have no reason to not think that this is going to be long lasting, but we just don't know. And at the end of the day, you know, as you rightly say, we are starting from a very good place, much better than if it was 50% effective, which could have easily been the case, and a lot of people expected that. So it's fine that we're starting. It's great that we're starting at this point. We just now have to wait and see how durable it is.
How quickly can we know how durable it is, Sam?
It literally is no way of speeding that up. We just have to wait. The length of time, for example, the next 6 months to 12 months will tell us a lot more about how long this can protect people. And let's not forget, we've had phase 2 trials already that have been about 6 months already. So there is data that will build over the next few months.
Sam, how often do you think we'll have to get this vaccine? Again, is it just too soon to say? There are a number of studies since April or even since March that say that if you develop antibodies because you catch COVID-19 from natural causes, so not with the vaccine, antibodies could fade, quite quickly. What does it mean for this trial?
Yeah, so that really has no bearing on how well a vaccine works. The virus has got mechanisms that it can interfere with the immune response and stop us developing good antibodies. So that's very different. Here you don't have the virus, you've got the vaccine. So I think it's a matter of time for us to be able to tell, and that the vaccine has got just as much chance of causing long-term immunity as you have with any other vaccine. The key question is, how quickly will the virus mutate to get around our vaccine?
Yeah, which is the million-dollar question. I know our Sam Fazeli, of course, is looking into that as well. Sam, thank you, as always, from Bloomberg Intelligence. Now, joining us is Jennifer Rohn, Principal Research Fellow at UCL. Jennifer, when you look at the vaccine and the conversation that we've also just had with Sam, your initial thoughts are that this is all positive, or is there a danger that we, stop social distancing because we think a vaccine is around the corner?
Well, good morning. I share the optimism that most of my colleagues have, cautious optimism, but I do also worry that people will let their guard down too soon. There are many countries now in lockdown. We're trying very hard to flatten curves. We need to keep up that good work because it is going to take some time for this vaccine to be rolled out. And of course, it might not work, but I am feeling more and more optimistic on that front.
Jennifer, in terms of timeline, so how quickly do you think we'll have the perfect formula that passes all the trials? And then from the moment we have that perfect formula, how long will it be to manufacturing and then distribution?
Well, it's my understanding that Pfizer is going to ask for emergency authorization in a couple of weeks if everything looks okay. But it will take time to scale up production. Of course, they're already producing it. They took a punt, and countries have even bought doses in advance. So production will be scaled up, but it's going to take time. This is a very interesting new kind of vaccine made out of RNA. It's not an old school vaccine, so there are a lot of issues with scale up, and the FDA is going to want to see evidence that the product that is scaled up is just as safe and efficacious as the trial version. So it's going to take ages, and I think it could be the middle of next year before countries really start rolling it out.
Jennifer, what's the next step, Dr. Rohn, in actually, what's the next piece of trial? What will Pfizer actually be looking at?
Well, over the next 2 years, they're going to be following up their cohort. They're going to be seeing whether the immunity lasts, as the previous gentleman was discussing. They're going to be looking at whether those 10% of people who don't get COVID, who do get COVID because it's only 90% effective, do those 10% of people get a less serious version? Does the vaccine prevent more serious in those who don't actually get prevented in the first place? And how long does that immunity last? That really is the big question. And I agree with your previous commenter that it is looking good for immunity. I think there's a chance that it'll be quite robust, but even if it isn't, we can go seasonal, we can give periodic vaccines. This is definitely possible.
Jennifer, is there something in the trial that we need to look at more deeper that could be of concern? And I'm not at all trying to put a damper on things, but I think it's mostly working on symptomatic people. Do you worry that even if if it's not given to enough of the population, and if it doesn't have an impact on asymptomatic COVID-infected people, then the virus could still be out of control?
Well, it is preventing infection. So whether it's symptomatic or not, 90% of people were affected. What I'm worried about is it's a very small sample size. So, probably only about 9 or 10 people got the jab if you look at the stats. So we just have to roll it out and see how it plays out in a larger population. And also, trials are very different from the real world. In the real world, people have underlying conditions. Lots of different people get it. And in a trial, they carefully control who gets the vaccine. But in the real world, this isn't true. So we just need to wait and see, as we keep saying, to see how it works when it's rolled out more widely in the population.
And Dr. Rohn, how do you convince people to take it, to make sure that it's safe, especially in the first wave of giving out the vaccine, distributing it?
Well, clearly, the FDA will not approve it if it's not safe. And there'll be a raft of safety data packages to examine, and people will just have to trust that the FDA knows what they're talking about. Of course they do. The problem we have is the anti-vaxxers who don't trust in any vaccine. And this is going to be a serious problem, but this is a problem with all vaccines now. So we have to hope that the specter of this terrible pandemic will be enough to focus people's minds about actually trusting vaccines.
Jennifer, thanks so much. Jennifer Owen, their Principal Research Fellow at UCL, with many great insights. Now, up next, much more on the markets. Overall, it's definitely clear we don't have the euphoria that we saw yesterday. Maybe a bit of profit taking, maybe the market also realizing some of the hurdles on the vaccine that we were just talking about with our Sam Fazeli and Jennifer Rowan. That would be distribution, but also some of the trials coming up. But it certainly feels like not a risk on, not a risk off mood, just markets kind of trailing sideways. We'll have plenty more market action. This is Bloomberg.
It is critically important that the markets stay open in this time, as opposed to trying to take breaks in the middle. I think that that'll just push off the situation a little bit, but actually could create other pent-up issues if you do close the markets.
I must stress that these are very, very early days.
It's clear that this vaccine, even if approved, will not be widely available for many months yet to come.
We absolutely cannot rely on this news as a solution, and the biggest mistake we could make now would be to slacken our resolve at a critical moment.
We're still facing a very dark winter.
That was President-elect Joe Biden and British Prime Minister Boris Johnson warning the public about a tough winter ahead despite the promising vaccine news. Now, if you look at some of the stocks, so European banks, I believe, are actually gaining quite significantly. A lot of the focus, of course, was on the vaccine yesterday, and today we're taking a bit of stock. So we're definitely not seeing the vaccine euphoria playing out on the markets that we were yesterday. European stocks are seeing modest gains. U.S. futures are still turning higher. I think there's maybe a bit of concern that a promising coronavirus vaccine still has hurdles to clear, but I've also heard that the market is still quite optimistic on that. What they're focusing on is actually more of the profit taking after the rally that we saw for the last 2 days. Now let's talk about what the vaccine means for the markets. Joining us now is John Hardy, head of FX strategy at Saxo Bank. John, great to have you on the program, because there's so much news, the vaccine, that I want to ask you also about a Biden administration and what it means for a dollar. If and when we get a vaccine, if it's a viable vaccine and enough people take it, what does it mean for your currency world?
Yeah, I think it's so important, some of the caveats you've been mentioning and your previous guest mentioned, because, of course, we've seen the market taking the ball and running with it to a degree, but there's so many questions here. But yes, given that if we do see this vaccine rolling out aggressively and get all the right news on that front in the ensuing months. The markets are always happy to, of course, react and trade on expectations far forward of where the on-the-ground reality is. So I think that we'll see an extension of what we saw yesterday, and that basically is safe haven currencies very weak, the Japanese yen, the Swiss franc, and then those more pro-cyclical currencies that thrive off of what I think will be likely a very weaker, much weaker dollar long term. EM currencies, commodity currencies doing very well in the long run. If this is the beginnings of the light at the end of the tunnel, and that we do see a world with this terrible COVID-19 shadow lifted from it longer term. So let's all hope that's the case, and that's my perceived how I think the market will react to that, FX market will react to that, if that is the outcome.
John, when you look at some of the things out there, is there a currency pair that we need to look out for that is not the classic haven that would benefit when we get a vaccine? Is there something a bit more unusual that we should start looking at?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think it's just going to be a broad, what are the most pro-cyclical spots out there for to place your money, and that's in the pro-cyclical currencies. That's going to be EM, everything that thrives off of dollar weakness and dollar liquidity, the price of global money remaining cheap, plenty of dollar liquidity out there, is going to thrive. So that's everything from Russian rubles, maybe some sanctions risks there, but the Brazilian real, South African rand, Mexican peso, etc. And then in the G10 space, Aussie and Kiwi and Canada, maybe to a slightly less smaller degree, the Canadian dollar, for example. I think the euro is stronger, but not a pronounced move there. It's still unattractive to hold euros. But if they do a larger fiscal than what we've seen so far, the recovery package comes out on the more generous side. I think that could be interesting and charge a bit more euro strength as well. The dollar weakness story is really driven by, we're going to see plenty of dollar liquidity even without the need for as much stimulus if the U.S. political gridlock scenario is there. We've got the U.S. Treasury with $1.6 trillion ready to spend if the stimulus bills are released there. We've got savers having saved a lot of that enormous cash splash we saw in the U.S. economy from last year, ready to spend it if their confidence in their situation on the ground changes. I think they will be happy to spend it. That spending feeds into the U.S. current account deficit, dollar weaker there. Treasury needs to issue less treasuries to absorb. Fed's still doing QE and will not be going anywhere on rates, even if inflation, as we suspect it will, begins to tick higher with that average inflation targeting regime. And if long rates in the U.S. start to tick up aggressively, I think that's the one risk here short term. If that move, like we saw yesterday, continues at anything resembling that pace in the next week or so, I think we might see a bit of a volatility across markets that could ironically support the dollar a little bit. But if the Fed comes in and supports lower yields across the curve, or at least caps yields across the curve, some kind of soft, whether it's explicit or not, but soft yield curve control at worst, that also helps, I think, the longer term U.S. dollar weaker narrative.
Yeah. John, what would be supportive of dollar in terms of composition of the Senate, if anything?
Well, theoretically, our scenario that we thought would see a lot of market volatility and potentially a stronger dollar was the one we seemed to have gotten. So I think it's a bit ironic that we saw the dollar quite weak after that, what apparently will be a gridlock. We still have this, this being 2020 after all, we still have the suspense. We don't actually know the final outcome of that Senate because of those two Georgia races. We need to wait till those elections coming there in January 5th. But we assumed that the gridlock would be a bad scenario for the dollar because we have far less stimulus, and we were assuming some degree of COVID-19 hangover that maybe or maybe not this vaccine has lifted. But I think the market took, I'm not sure the market reaction was entirely trustworthy in the immediate wake of the election, but I think the narrative is supposed to be, well, that just means the Fed will be that much more hyperactive. Mm-hmm. But I still think that scenario brought some risks for the dollar bearish view. But if we get a COVID-19 vaccine, I think I think some of those worries about gridlock for the dollar bearish scenario have been lifted to a degree.
John, thank you so much. John Hardy, their head of FX strategy at Saxo Bank. Now, coming up, the global equities rally is slowing its pace today as investors reflect on the timeline for a vaccine. We'll get a check on the markets shortly. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Surveillance. I'm Francine Lacquet here in London. Now, the risk asset rally is stalling after Monday's euphoric trading. Let's get a check-in on the markets with our Danny Berger. Hi, Danny.
Hi, Francine. Well, looking across asset here, you can certainly see some of the assets that had big moves yesterday are turning around today or really just not doing too much. Now, one of the trends we saw with this euphoria over the vaccine was a big selling of U.S. 10-years. You can see the yield moving a bit higher today, but really unchanged compared to yesterday. The dollar changing to losses from its gains. A lot of short covering we saw yesterday, perhaps fueling some of those gains, and gold as well getting another bid. The real question here over markets as they digest the optimism over Pfizer's vaccine is what this actually means for the medium term. How long will it take to distribute? Does Congress coalesce this narrative of a vaccine soon, which means there'll be less stimulus? Certainly questions the market is asking today. So a slight reversal of trends. But one trend that is certainly holding up is in equity markets. Let's switch up the board. I want to show you what the Stock 600 is doing in terms of sectors. You'll notice some of the best performing sectors today, banks and energy, and the worst performing health and technology. This is a really clear-cut value versus momentum trade. Momentum got pummeled yesterday, and it continues to get pummeled today with tech stocks selling off more than 2%, and value, that bank play, classic value, up more than 3%. But look, I would argue rather than this being a big rotation into value, it more so is a big stop out of momentum. Let me show you my chart. Basically, momentum falling 4% yesterday. This is a pure momentum in the U.S. Well, value is little change. So really those momentum positions flooding out of there. We'll see if this rotation has any staying power, Francine.
Danny, thanks so much. Danny Berger there with some of the market action. Now, coming up, transatlantic tit for tat. The EU slaps tariffs on $4 billion of U.S. goods. We'll be discussing the long-standing trade dispute with Pascal Lamy. He's the former WTO Director General. Of course, we'll also ask him what Joe Biden administration means for world trade, what it means for multilateralism. And of course, we'll talk about China and what the next 18 months will bring. The markets no longer rallying after the 2 days of positive gains. The focus is not only on the hurdles that the vaccines may actually bring up, but a couple of people on the markets also saying this could just be a bit of profit taking. A global stocks rally tempering. This is Bloomberg.
Another day of risk off across the financial markets. We bring you special coverage of all the price action and implications here on Bloomberg Television.
is actually poor.
No foreplay?
Eat your bag of Lay's with a smile on your face.
If all the diseases have been taken, I'll take a tax.
Economics, finance, politics. This is Bloomberg Surveillance. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Let's get straight to the Bloomberg. First Word News, here's Laura Wright. Hi, Laura.
Good morning, Francine. Results of a COVID-19 vaccine trial from Pfizer and BioNTech are fueling optimism the world will soon have a way out of the pandemic. But experts are cautioning the shot still has many hurdles to clear. There are questions about production and distribution, as well as how much and for how long the vaccine will protect you. U.S. Attorney General William Barr has authorized Justice Department officials to open inquiries into election fraud. He says U.S. attorneys across the country can pursue substantial allegations of voting irregularities. He's acknowledging there is no conclusive evidence and says speculative, fanciful or far-fetched claims should not be the basis for investigations. Armenia's Prime Minister says he signed an agreement to end the war over Nagorno-Karabakh. It comes just days after Azerbaijan captured a key strategic city in the contested region. Russian President Vladimir Putin says the agreement will be the basis for long-term stability in the war-torn region. Global news, 24 hours a day on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. This is Bloomberg, Francine.
Laura, thanks so much. Now, the European Union will impose tariffs on $4 billion of U.S. goods starting today. The decision is the latest in the transatlantic fight over illegal aid to aircraft manufacturers Boeing and Airbus. Well, European Commissioner for Trade, Valdis Dombrovskis, said the tariffs have nothing to do with Joe Biden's victory.
The decision related to tariffs in Boeing case is not linked with U.S. elections. It's linked with the fact that WTO has given us the award for $4 billion and linked with our internal procedures.
Well, joining us now from Brussels is our reporter Maria Tadeo. Maria, how much of this procedure, how much is actually genuine escalation?
Right, Francine, and I really think that is the way to frame it. When you look at what's happening, yes, you do have tariffs and retaliation that is coming into play, but a lot of this is just purely the mechanics of it, is the bureaucracy. The European Union was awarded the right to do this by WTO. They didn't get the United States to pull their tariffs, so they went ahead with this. But when you look at the politics, you forget about the bureaucracy, but really the politics of this decision. The Europeans have no appetite to escalate going forward. In fact, they're hoping that what you get a Biden administration in 2021 that is going to reset the relationship between the European Union and the United States, that this will be the end of tariffs as a negotiating tool, that this is the end of tweets as being made politics, and you would go back to a normal relationship. So I would say don't read too much into that decision. The European Union, in reality, in practical terms, has no appetite to escalate or go down a path where they continue to use retaliation and tariffs to set the policy.
Maria, thank you so much. We'll have plenty more, of course, on trade, on the relationship, and one of the key questions that we were trying to understand as the Joe Biden administration tries to transition is really what his victory means for multilateralism. Now, coming up on Bloomberg Surveillance, going for green, could common climate change goals bring the U.S. and the U.K. closer? Our exclusive conversation with the U.K.'s Chancellor is next. This is Bloomberg.
from it. We have only begun the process of obtaining an accurate, honest vote count. We are fighting for the rights of all Americans who want to have faith and confidence not only in this election, but in the many elections to come. There is only one party in America that opposes voter ID. One party in America that opposes verifying signatures, citizenship, residency, eligibility. There is only one party in America trying to keep observers out of the count room. And that party, my friends,
This is Bloomberg Surveillance. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, the UK Chancellor of the Exchequer is making green innovation the centerpiece of his vision for Britain's financial services future as he looks to overhaul the sector. Well, he spoke exclusively to our Guy Johnson.
We want to remain one of the most open places to do business anywhere in the world. We want to be on the leading edge of technological adoption. And importantly, we want to be a leader in green finance. So today we announced we will be issuing a green sovereign bond for the first time next year and being, I think, the first major economy to mandate the climate disclosures across the economy by 2025. I think taken together, it cements our position of wanting to be a global leader on these issues.
Okay, let's dig into that, because there's a lot in there already. Let's talk a little bit about what's happening with the gilt market. So we are going to see next year green gilts being issued. How is a regular gilt going to differ from a green gilt? Do you think that green gilt should have a yield premium, trade at a higher premium, for example, to regular gilts? And how will investors ensure that the promises that are made as part of those green gilts are actually delivered upon?
Yeah. Well, we've been watching this market for a while to make sure that it was the right thing to do. And I think what we've been now convinced of, looking at the market experience, is a couple of things. You know, one is, I mean, obviously we can make sure that the proceeds go to the areas and the types of things that people will expect them to. There's essentially an existing framework we can use to deploy, as other countries have for that. But to the point on pricing, I think what's clear looking at the market is what green gilts do is bring in a new class of investor as well. And we are now seeing repeated issuances of sovereign green bonds, which trade at tighter spreads to existing gilts, I think partly driven by different investors coming in. Now, I think that's something we want to tap into. The other benefit of launching a sovereign curve is that it means that private companies then have the ability to piggyback on that, and it will help grow a private green market in the UK and give UK investors also access to more GBP denominated bonds, where currently they might have to invest in green bonds in different currencies. So I think there's a lot of other things that issuing the green sovereign bond will help catalyse.
But you think there will be a higher yield for a green bond, and do you think that spread will eventually compress down to virtually nothing?
Yeah, we'll have, markets are markets, and markets will price what they want to do. I think what we're seeing, the experience of other countries now, is that there are green issues that trade at a tighter spread. It's obviously going to vary as to where you are and what market demand is at the appropriate time. But that's something that we've been watching. But I think, as I said, the interesting thing is what else it catalyses. So once you can start creating that sovereign green bond market, that will help private participants also issue green bonds, make sure there's more GBP-oriented liquidity in that market. All of that is great for what we're trying to do here. What are we trying to do? We're trying to attract capital into funding projects that will help us meet our ambitions on net zero, and this will be an important part of that.
We now look as if we're going to have a Joe Biden presidency in the United States. The Prime Minister asked about this over the weekend, talked about the fact that there is more that unites us than divides us. Do you worry that calculation has now changed? The Prime Minister had a very close relationship with Donald Trump. Do you think this will make life difficult for the UK on the trade front? Do you think it will make a trade deal less likely?
No, I mean, first of all, enormous congratulations to President-elect Biden and Kamala Harris. As the dad of 2 little girls, I think fantastic to see first female vice president in the United States, for the signal that that will send and the inspiration that it provides. And I agree with the PM. There's so much that unites our 2 countries. Obviously, it's a place that I've lived and worked for many years myself. Climate change is something I would put at the top of that list. The announcements I made today about the UK wanting to show global leadership and progress the climate change agenda when it comes to financial services. Hopefully that's something that we can work very closely on. It's something that President-elect Biden spoke about a lot during the campaign. So I remain very optimistic and excited about the relationship that we will have with the new administration.
That was the UK Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak, speaking to our colleague Guy Johnson. Now let's get back to what a new US administration would mean for trade and for Europe. Joining us now, we're delighted, is Pascal Lamy. He's chair of the Paris Peace Forum and the former WTO Director General. Monsieur Lamy, thank you for joining us, and congratulations on the Peace Forum, which I know starts this week and lasts a couple of days, and it really spans a lot of the good work done in sustainability, but also trade. When you look at what a Biden administration does for trade, are we going to go back to multilateralism?
Well, I think some things will change, and obviously Biden's view of what international cooperation means and the way to run it is profoundly different from the previous Trump stance. Trump was trying to demolish the international rules-based trading system for reasons of his own, because he doesn't believe that open trade is a good thing. He's a protectionist. But Biden is on a different stance. So the attitude, the vision, the method to move things will be profoundly different. What will not change is that this world, with the COVID crisis, will have even more fragmented than before, will have a hard time on agreeing on the necessary reforms of the World Trade Organization, which necessitate a consensus. So I expect the US to be back at the negotiating table at the WTO, and this is extremely good news. I also expect EU and US to cooperate a bit more, notably to try and bring China more into further WTO discipline, especially on state aid. But Biden does not have a magic wand on trade, and his own democratic constituency, and notably the part of it which is run by the AFL-CIO, as we all know, is more protectionist than average. So this will remain an issue.
Mr. Lamy, can I ask you what you think a Biden administration could do to reach out to Europe and try and settle the dispute on Airbus and Boeing?
Well, this Airbus-Boeing dispute has been going on for the last 20 years. When the U.S. Stepped out of the understanding which existed at the time, according to which both sides would recognize that they have to subsidize long-range planes, but they do it differently. The question is, are Boeing and Airbus ready to settle this? Can we build between Airbus and Boeing an agreement that they both are subsidized in different ways, but in proportion with both recognized as fair? That's the main question. Then, of course, if that is the case, it has to go at the political level. And I think if Boeing and Airbus believe it's a good thing to do, which I would advise them to do, not least stop spending hundreds of millions of dollars in illegal fees with extremely well-paid lawyers on both sides of the Atlantic, then the question is, would Brussels and Washington agree? I think with Trump, the answer was no way. With Biden, there is a good chance that the answer is yes.
So, Monsieur Lamy, is the timing a bit odd? Is it a bit of a miscalculation on the EU side to put tariffs from today when they could have waited to negotiate with Biden in 2021?
No, I think that's the right thing to do. The Americans have put tariffs. They haven't removed it. The EU put their tariffs. Now we are on par, tariff-wise, so to say. And so it's a good way to start the negotiation, saying, let's de-escalate, let's on both sides remove our tariffs we've put against each other. The thing is now balanced. This is the condition for negotiation to start.
Are there ways that Europe can actually work with the Biden administration to try and have a united front to look at distortion coming from China?
I think there is a scope for that, which did not exist with Trump. As we all know, Macron, Merkel several times had conversations with Trump saying, why don't we try to work together in order to bring China more into further rules of more fair international trade. Trump did not want to do that. He believed he would be the guy who would untwist China himself. This is changed. And then this triangle between US, EU, China, I think EU and US will more cooperate with the Biden administration in order to try and move the Chinese into accepting more global disciplines on subsidization, and notably state-owned enterprises, which, as we know, is a problem which hasn't been solved so far.
Why is the WTO so unable to select a new leader?
Well, the WTO is an organization between sovereigns. So there's not the WTO on the one side and member states on the other side. Member states of the WTO run the WTO. If they agree, there is a WTO agreement. If they disagree, there is no agreement. So the question is, are the main trading powers ready to go back to the negotiating table and say, we have this, and this problem, Chinese subsidies, trade and environment, digital trade, can we agree that we modernize, we revamp, we review the rule book of WTO in order to address the problems we have? So the precondition is that they would be ready to negotiate. I think that with the Biden administration, the answer is rather yes, whereas with the Trump administration, the answer was obviously no. What Trump tried to do was destroy, paralyze, damage the world trading system. This can change, which doesn't mean it will.
What would you do for the WTO to become more relevant to citizens and business? What is your vision for WTO 2.0?
Well, I think there's obviously to modernize the rule book of WTO, which dates from the 90s, and the world has changed, and trade has changed, and technology has changed, and supply chains have changed, and multi-localization has changed. We have issues that we need to address in order to ensure that trade opening, which remains the way to go, is done with as much as possible of a level playing field. So this is the strategic view. We need to do that with China on subsidies, with the rest of the WTO membership on trade and environment, and notably issues around border carbon adjustment, which are coming to the fore. We need to modernize the rules for digital trade. All this is perfectly possible, provided countries agree to negotiate. On top of that, there are probably a few institutional problems in the way the WTO works. I was a WTO DG some time ago for 2 mandates, and my own view, for what it's worth, is that the WTO as a machinery, as an organization, needs a rebalancing. Member states have, in a way, too much of a say, and the Secretariat and the DG of the WTO have too little of a say. The WTO has to go where international organizations have gone in other areas, which is a capacity for the Secretariat, or the DG, to influence the agenda and to make proposals and to run it forward. This also needs to be addressed, in my view.
All right, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Pascal Lamy there, the former WTO Director General. A quick check on the markets, because we did have the euphoria of yesterday, partly because of Joe Biden administration, together with a possible Republican Senate, means that there wouldn't be much news. But really, yesterday, this euphoria was really driven by the vaccine, by Pfizer. Today, cooler heads are prevailing in the markets. They're looking at some of the hurdles, but also there is just chatter that there was profit taking peaking after the huge rally that we saw over the last 48 hours. Now, coming up, we get the latest on the U.S. election as President Trump continues to dispute the outcome. This is Bloomberg.
Climate change is the defining issue of our time, so we've redefined how we cover it. With clear data and rigorous journalism, we rise to the scale of the challenge to reveal the breadth of possibility. We look at stories from every angle to provoke debate, spotlight solutions, and make sense of the greatest crisis of our generation. Bloomberg Green, solutions for a changing climate.
It is critically important that the markets stay open in this time, as opposed to trying to take breaks in the middle. I think that that'll just push off the situation a little bit, but actually could create other pent-up issues if you do close the markets.
Governments have been at this for decades. And while we made some good progress, there have been some good initiatives and some good schemes, it's not enough. We're not on track to hit the net zero by 2050, which is what's required to keep our climate change to under 1.5 degrees. The private markets have stepped in to do their own thing.
That was the Standard Chartered Chief Executive Bill Winter speaking to Bloomberg earlier this morning. Now, President Trump's Attorney General, William Barr, will let the Justice Department investigate potential voting irregularities in the presidential election. But Barr has acknowledged there is no conclusive evidence, and he warned against what he called far-fetched claims. After Barr announced the new policy, the head of the department's election crimes branch resigned. Well, joining us now for more is our senior writer, Stephanie Baker. Stephanie, always great to get your perspective on things. What's the overall significance of Barr's latest move?
Yeah, well, his move is unprecedented, and he admitted as much in his memo. Election irregularities and fraud investigations are supposed to be conducted by the states, and the DOJ doesn't get involved until after elections have been certified and confirmed by the states, which hasn't happened yet. And, they're not supposed to be conducting overt investigations. So, I mean, it's reassuring that Barr asked prosecutors to not investigate, what he called fanciful or far-fetched claims, and only, to pursue claims that, if true, would impact the outcome of the election. And, so far, none of those claims that have been advanced would do so. But by doing this, he is undermining the results of the election and adding to questions about election integrity, which is the opposite of what he says he's doing. So, as a legal strategy, it doesn't seem to be working. It does seem to be, in response to Trump's claims, and demands that his Justice Department pursue, the whole issue of voter fraud.
Stephanie, why are Republicans backing Trump's claims?
Yeah, it's a very curious strategy. It's not a legal strategy that's expected to result in anything. And, you see Mitch McConnell saying that the president is justified in pursuing these claims and that the Democrats shouldn't expect him to concede, feeding this narrative. And, so McConnell is continuing his role as Trump's enabler. So, you'd think on the one hand that if they wanted to retain control of the Senate, then Republicans would acknowledge Biden's win and move on, not get distracted by these pointless recounts and legal challenges that are not expected to result in any change, and throw every penny and all their time at Georgia, where there are runoffs for two key Senate races that will determine, whether or not Democrats control Washington in January. But I think Republicans are clearly worried about alienating Trump voters, and the strategy, I think, now clearly seems to be to motivate Trump voters to come out in those races by advancing this conspiracy theory that the presidency was stolen and they need to come out and vote for Republicans. I mean, that's the only thing I can see as a political strategy. This shows that Trump is still kingmaker in the Republican Party.
Stephanie, how disruptive can the president be during the transition?
I think it is a huge problem that the General Services Administration, led by a Trump appointee, is refusing to sign off on the election and release transition funds, and crucially allow security clearances to proceed and allow security briefings for President-elect Biden. I think it is a real problem. I mean, even the 9/11 Commission acknowledged that any delay in security briefings in particular could weaken the incoming administration. So, I mean, I think it is a real problem, and I think that, even you see Marco Rubio, the Republican senator, saying there's no reason why the GSA
Stephanie?
can't proceed.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Our Stephanie Baker there. We'll have plenty more, of course, on U.S. politics shortly. This is Bloomberg.
Another day of risk off across the financial markets. We bring you special coverage of all the price action and implications here on Bloomberg Television.
Market euphoria over vaccine stalls. There's concern Pfizer study still has hurdles to clear. President-elect Joe Biden warns of a tough winter ahead. Pandemic warning. The Fed says there could be major downsides for asset prices if the economic impact of the virus is not mitigated. And Trump continues his fight to overturn the election results. Attorney General Barr authorizes the DOJ to open investigations while acknowledging there is no conclusive evidence of fraud. Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance. I'm Francine Lacqua in London, Tom Keene in New York. Tom, we look at the vaccine. I know we'll chat with our Sam Fazeli at some of the hurdles for the vaccine. We look at markets. We definitely don't have the euphoria that we had yesterday, but we really need to spend also a bit of time back on U.S. politics to try and understand what the Republican Party is trying to do with Michael Barr.
Well, within economics, finance, investment, and politics are all on fire right now, Francine. The markets here are stable. We'll do a data check in a moment, but let's remember, J.P. Morgan at one point yesterday, Francine, went up 15%. That was the kind of move we saw. Yeah. Last night, Francine, and a lot of people miss this in America, exhausted from the election, we had at 8 or 9 p.m. Mr. Barr making these statements. We'll be covering this all day. I would suggest, Francine, this is a huge deal. The Attorney General's language was extremely careful. Every word was chiseled out. And for me, the headline is the 20-year veteran of this under election crimes, Mr. Pilger, a clerk to James Moody, who's a legend in Chicago. Pilger resigned. To me, that's the real headline.
Yeah, it's a huge deal, Tom. And, you know, we're trying to figure out exactly what this means for the Republican Party and the strategy possible there. I know I really enjoyed speaking to our Stephanie Baker, who says this could have something to do with the Senate election in Georgia. So we'll have plenty more on that. Now let's get straight to the Bloomberg First Word News. Here's Ritika Gupta. Hi, Ritika.
Morning, Francine. Tom, President Trump's Attorney General William Barr will let the Justice Department investigate potential voting irregularities in the presidential election. But Barr has acknowledged there is no conclusive evidence, and he warned against what he called far-fetched claims after Barr announced the new policy. The head of the department's election crimes branch resigned. The U.S. is set to hit record hospitalizations for the coronavirus this week. Numbers are soaring in Midwest states such as Illinois and Michigan. Meanwhile, in Texas, the city of El Paso has more people hospitalized with the virus than at 29 states. And starting today, the European Union will impose tariffs on $4 billion of U.S. goods. It's a tit-for-tat escalation of a fight over illegal aid to aircraft manufacturers Boeing and Airbus. The EU says it would drop the tariffs if the U.S. removes duties imposed on EU products last year. In the UK, the House of Lords rejected government plans to break international law over Brexit. They voted to remove the most controversial parts of the internal market bill. Prime Minister Boris Johnson immediately vowed to push ahead with the legislation. It gives ministers the power to rewrite parts of the Brexit deal Johnson signed with the EU. Global news 24 hours a day on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg. Francine, Tom.
Ritika, thanks so much. How about a data check after what we saw yesterday? Extraordinary. Let me give you levels here, much more than change. SPX 3551 up 8 points. Dow over 29,000, 29,275. To be careful here, Dow futures yesterday touched 30,000 for a split second and then came back. The actual cash Dow did not get to 30,000. The VIX 24.68 in a full stick right now off of that rebound that we saw yesterday, that snapback, I should say. Oil, Fadi B-roll scheduled to be with us, I believe, later. 40.77 on West Texas. Brent crude 42.99. And I'd also note, Francine, Japanese yen. You've got to pay attention to a much weaker yen versus euro, 105.35.
Yeah, Tom, the market is kind of moving sideways today. So it's partly, of course, because of the vaccine. And again, we look at the hurdles, but partly just because of the euphoria that we had in the last 72 hours. Treasuries steady as investors focusing on the risks that fresh U.S. fiscal stimulus may now be less than expected. Overall, the global rally is kind of pausing. And, you know, it's very telling that the European stocks are gaining some 0.5%. And then ZEW worse than expected. Joining us now is Jim Reed. He's Deutsche Bank Global Head of Fund fundamental credit strategy. Jim, we have like 1,000,001 questions after the last 7 days that we had on the market. What is the market looking at right now? Is it the vaccine? Is all the good news priced in? Are they looking at stimulus in the U.S.?
Well, there's a lot to look at over the last week, which are a bit conflicting. Look, the vaccine news, I think, is very, very good news. Obviously, we don't know everything yet, so we reserve the right to change our mind. But I think the vaccine, in a way, should be seen as a global fiscal stimulus. So we got disappointment last week on the US potential fiscal stimulus, but this potentially is the equivalent of a global fiscal stimulus. So I think the story is positive and it's got more room to run.
Jim, what do you do with US junk bond right now?
Look, most of the junk bonds are probably, well, most of the stressed bonds in high yield are probably in the cyclical areas, which probably are going to be supported by any hopes of a vaccine. I mean, you have to look at kind of airline hospitality stocks yesterday, and that they soared, and that's where probably the weakest parts of the high yield market are. So I think, look, this news is potentially positive for cyclicals.
Jim Reed, we've had a reset in yield. The 10-year U.S. full faith and credit up near 1%. What is that significance? Is it a breakout? Is it a new higher range that we're in? How do you frame that?
As I said earlier, I think this is probably like a global fiscal stimulus. So I probably would have a bit more confidence in non-US yields going higher than US yields, because this is a global thing. Obviously, the story last week was very US-centric, and the disappointment was US-centric. I think this is more of a global push, and therefore other yield markets might sell off more than the US, which has still got uncertainties to come on the fiscal side.
I mean, the price and the yield here is really, really extraordinary. Are they correlated right now to equities? I mean, yesterday everything was correlated, but is it a tight market, or is there a lot of dysfunction within it?
Well, I mean, if you look at what's happened in the last 9 months or so, treasuries have perhaps lagged the risk on elsewhere. So I wouldn't say that they're particularly tight to equities. If you believe they were, treasury yields should be a lot higher than this. So there's obviously something else going on in markets, whether that's QE or other things. But treasuries are definitely expensive relative to the risk on you've seen since the lows in March.
Jim, overall, what happens under a Biden administration to credit in the U.S.? I know it's very difficult to know because we still don't know whether Republicans, if they hold on to the Senate, will actually, try and do everything to not give him what he wants, or whether they'll actually play along. But what's your feeling right now?
In terms of credit, or in terms of U.S. Treasuries, which were you referring to?
Let's start with U.S. Treasuries.
Yeah, well, it is a bit of a push-pull. I mean, look, you wouldn't need such a big fiscal stimulus if the news on the vaccine was as good as the early indication from Pfizer yesterday. So there is a bit of offsetting to this now. Look, there's still a lot of pension demand for fixed income out there. There's still a lot of QE. Most central banks are buying most of the issuance that governments are bringing. So, it's unlikely, absent a big rise in inflation, that treasury yields are going to go out of control, and that's why I think I think the best way to play this is to diversify your kind of. If you wanted to be short, I probably would be short other government bond markets rather than the US at this stage.
Jim, when you look at the European yield, and we were looking actually at the Spanish 10-year yield, the Portuguese 10-year yield, how likely is it that these will continue going lower and could also go into negative territory? And if it goes in negative territory, what does it actually tell us?
Well, it's a supply and demand issue as much as anything else, because the ECB are effectively buying all of the new issuance this year and the next couple of years and more probably. It is a bit of a push-pull, because obviously if this vaccine news continues, bonds will go up in yield and spreads will tighten, and it's which probably overpowers the other. does the tightening of spreads overpower the overall rise in yield? So, a vaccine news, could make positive vaccine news could make negative yields less likely across the board, but the odd country which has got spread to bund might dip into it because spreads tighten.
Jim Reed, thank you so much. Greatly appreciate it with Deutsche Bank this morning here on fixed income. And again, that 10-year yield, 0.94%. Boy, is that a long ways away from that high-end range of 0.71 that we had a week ago or so. Francine, give me an update on the lockdown in the United Kingdom. We are seeing stunning statistics across all of America in case growth and, yes, even deaths rising. But what we're focused on is hospitalization. What are they focused on the continent and in the United Kingdom?
Well, Tom, it's the same, really. It's hospitalization, and I know we're speaking to a number of mayors. It's really the big cities, the big metropolises, such as London, that probably have a tougher job in containing the virus. So I think we're on to day 5, Tom, of this national lockdown. I have to say the difference between London and Paris, London and Milan, is that we're in full lockdown here, but there are not many checks on the street. So if you go to a park at a weekend, you could say it's overcrowded. Yeah. So, you could argue that, sure, you're fine in lockdown, but if people don't respect it, then it could be lockdown light. Well said. Absolutely bizarre, and it's very much what we have here as well. Maybe we've got a lot of masks on versus the United Kingdom. I really don't think it is much difference. Coming up, there'll be a simulcast. We'll do radio and TV. Joining us, Robert Kaplan, the Dallas Fed president. A busy day for the gentleman from Texas. I will be speaking to him at length at the Council on Foreign Relations this afternoon. That will be open to the media. You'll get reports on that tomorrow, but we'll get ahead of that in the 8 o'clock hour with Mr. Kaplan. Stay with us. Futures up 2, Dow futures up a mere 195 points. This is Bloomberg. Good morning.
Expected, not only in terms of job creation, but also a sharp fall in the unemployment rate consistent with higher labor force participation. That's really good news.
Overall, the gain was solid, but even while this is a very robust pace of job gains, it's a lot slower than it has been in the summer months.
Great that we saw the job gains we did, but they still are diminished from what they were, of course, back in April and May. And the scarring, the sort of wounds that were created by COVID are beginning to fester.
I would caution people to look at the top line number because I don't think it tells the entire story. Employment relative to population is still well below where we were pre-crisis, and that's because I think that we're going to have some lasting damage.
Depending on what you look at, jobs creation or the unemployment rate, you have different views as to whether the improvement in the labor force is keeping up or slowing down.
Surveillance. Good morning, everyone. Francine Lacroix and Tom Keene. We welcome all of you worldwide, and of course, in the mid-morning of London, in the early morning of America. It is an America waking up to another resignation, this time at the Department of Justice, over a letter put out by the Attorney General late last night. Stephanie Baker joins, our senior writer and truly expert on these affairs. Stephanie Baker, Richard Pilger is out of Notre Dame. He is a 28-year distinguished bureaucrat in chasing people for election extortion, election bribery, and even was involved in the notorious Jack Abramoff case of years ago. Why did this guy resign?
Well, Barr's move is unprecedented, and it flies in the face of established Justice Department rules, which say that fraud investigations are supposed to be conducted by the states, and the DOJ does not get involved until after the elections have been certified and confirmed by the states. Moreover, they're not supposed to openly announce these investigations. You know, they don't want this to interfere with any, ongoing election counts, et cetera. So, I can see why he resigned. It is, again, another move by Barr that, flies in the face of established Justice Department rules. It's somewhat comforting that he's saying,
right,
that they should not be investigating claims that are far-fetched. But it does, in the end, I think, contribute to the narrative that there is some problem and, undermines the integrity of the election result.
If we speculated that the president and the attorney general were getting out front with federal usurping states' rights, what would any court do on this? It just seems to me that if any of this sees a light of day in court, somewhere in the judicial process, they'll just go, no, you can't do this. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. And already you've seen the claims that they've brought forward have gone nowhere. And none of the claims that they've brought forward, are likely to change the outcome of the election. I mean, for instance, in Nevada, the Trump campaign is challenging 3,000 votes, they say, cast by people who moved out of the state. Now, even if that were to be proven, it would not change the outcome of the Nevada result because Biden is up by so many votes. By and large, across the board, none of these recounts or legal challenges are going to, put into question anywhere near the number of votes that they would need to overturn the result. So, as a legal strategy, it does not look like it will go anywhere. It's likely to just ground to a halt. It's designed to encourage, Trump's narrative that the election has been stolen from him, and is something that he's likely to push and continue to push for years.
But Stephanie, why are Republicans backing these claims? What's the strategy, if there's one, behind it?
Yeah, you would think that they would want to retain control of the Senate and that they would move on to try to not get distracted by these pointless recounts and legal challenges and throw every penny and all of their time at Georgia, where there are runoffs for 2 key Senate seats that will determine control of the Senate and whether or not Democrats might control Washington come January. But I think Republicans are clearly worried about alienating Trump's voters, scared that Trump might turn against them. And the strategy now seems to be to motivate Trump voters to come out for those races in Georgia by advancing this conspiracy theory that the presidency was stolen and that they need to turn out in huge numbers to make sure that the Republicans retain control of the Senate.
So, Stephanie, what does this mean for the transition? How messy will the transition be, and who gets hurt by this most?
It does make the transition messy, and you even have Senator Marco Rubio saying that there's no reason why the General Services Administration can't ascertain the results, sign off on the election result and release transition funds and allow security clearances to proceed. He says there's no reason why that can't go ahead while the various legal challenges proceed at the same time. We're in the middle of a pandemic. It's a national crisis, and there are serious security concerns. Trump already fired the defense secretary, Esper. That creates a vacuum there. I think there are real concerns about security and about pandemic planning by refusing to release those transition funds and let the transition proceed.
Stephanie, you've done great work on money. Is this all about money? Is all we're looking at is a president, the piggy bank's empty because he was running for election, he spent all his money, et cetera, and all this action is really about fundraising? Can I be that cynical?
I think probably money is part of it. I think Trump's concerns about his legal liabilities, if he's no longer president, is a huge part of this. I think fundamentally this is all about the fact that Trump, despite his loss, got 71 million people to vote for him, and that gives him political power. That will continue to drive decision-making within the Republican Party going forward as they are scared of getting on Trump's wrong side.
All right, thank you so much for all of the great reporting, of course, and analysis. Our Stephanie Baker there, and we'll have plenty more on U.S. politics with Stephanie throughout the day. Now, coming up on Balance of Power, Dr. Mark McClellan, the former FDA commissioner. That's at 12 p.m. in New York, 5 p.m. in London. Also, a bit of breaking news out of Amazon. This is according to Dow Jones, citing EU sources. The EU may file formal charges against Amazon for anti-competitive business practices. So we'll see exactly what that means for the Amazon share price and the internet giant. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Best, your weekly review of the most important business news, analysis, and interviews from Bloomberg Television around the world.
Ken Burns, welcome to Bloomberg Big Decisions.
We have always been a mixture of things. We are always stronger for that mixture.
Growth is a way to stay competitive, delight more and more consumers.
Welcome to the Best of Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang.
They've moved the needle by acknowledging that they have to monitor the content.
What is one word of advice you'll take with you?
Learn how to listen. And that is certainly something that has served me well.
Ankiti, where do you go from here? It's a huge market. It's a huge opportunity. I want to go 100x from here.
Our philosophy is to partner where we can and stand apart when we should.
So do you get tired of people calling you a jazz legend? Do you feel older when they say that to you?
Yeah, I like the word jazz. I don't like the legend.
The outlook for the economy is extraordinarily uncertain and will depend in large part on the success of efforts to keep the virus in check.
They are torturing themselves to explain that they're there, ready, willing, and able.
The Fed has basically done all it can do, with the exception of extreme emergency measures.
This is a market that over the past few weeks has made it clear it wants to go higher. It got a little spooked by the idea that geopolitical tensions are rising.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance. I'm Ritika Gupta with your Bloomberg Business Flash. Experts are warning that the coronavirus vaccine from Pfizer and BioNTech still has many hurdles to clear. Results from tests fueled optimism that the world will soon have a way out of the pandemic. Still, there are questions about the vaccine's production, distribution, and safety. Pfizer expects to have safety data for people in trial by next week. Bayer may face up to 4 trials in the U.S. next year over its Roundup weed killer. A judge in San Francisco says he's ready to resume putting cases in front of juries. Bayer announced an $11 billion settlement plan in June. Still, there are thousands of lawsuits accusing Roundup of causing cancer that haven't been resolved. For the first time ever, there are now 5 people on the planet who are worth more than $100 billion, according to the Bloomberg Billionaires Index. French luxury titan Bernard Arnault joined the club yesterday. Promising results of a coronavirus vaccine pushed stocks higher, including Arnault's LVMH. Other centibillionaires include Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, and Elon Musk. And that's your Bloomberg Business Flash. Tom?
Enrica, thank you so much. And much of the Louis Vuitton gazillionaires, a contribution from the Keene household. Let's do a data check right now. Red and green on the screen, maybe adapting off that Amazon fine. To give you an idea on the fine, if Amazon had to do a 10% of global revenue fine, Francine, that would clock in somewhere between Estonia and Lithuania's GDP per year, which is how absurd that is. Let's finish the data check by saying dollar fractionally stronger. Francine?
Yeah, Tom, that statistic really puts it in perspective. And one of the regulators here, was talking about just how much these giants that we use every day, how much money they make. And we kind of really forget the size and scope of some of that. Global rally that we saw yesterday, the one that we saw even to some extent on Friday, has paused. There is a bit of concern about this promising coronavirus vaccine, the fact that they have hurdles to clear. But part of it is also a bit of profit taking. Now, coming up next, we look at the vaccine. We look at COVID-19 with Paul Hunter, University of East Anglia professor in medicine. This is Bloomberg.
their CPG history, their experience, and really how we might be able to combine together to really create this fantastic public company. And so we kind of got into the SPAC thing a little bit before it became such a hot method of going public.
Give you a sense of the real-time action, the 10-year yield tumbling now 11 basis points, so continuing in this knee-jerk risk-off feel.
I must stress that these are very, very early days.
It's clear that this vaccine, even if approved, will not be widely available for many months yet to come.
We absolutely cannot rely on this news as a solution, and the biggest mistake we could make now would be to slacken our resolve at a critical moment.
We're still facing a very dark winter.
The politics of the United States, and we welcome all of you here on Bloomberg Surveillance. Francine Lacroix in London. I'm Tom Keene in New York. Francine, it's going to be an eventful day. The Secretary of Defense fired yesterday, and really there's almost an assumption, Francine, that we'll see further firings from Mr. Trump.
Yeah, Tom, so we need to, of course, look at that. And I do think we need to spend a bit more time, as you rightly said yesterday, to look at the transition. It doesn't look like it's going to be peaceful. I understand much more now about, the minutiae, literally who signs what papers in the U.S. presidential, election transition, which we've never thought about, Tom. So we've suddenly all become experts also on U.S. political transitions.
And speaking of experts, as we do economics, finance, and investment, and when we look at the pandemic, we have decided to speak to experts. It is wonderful to have back-to-back with us two gentlemen who studied at the Heath Hospital in Cardiff, Wales. One, of course, is Paul Hunter. We'll get to him in a moment, the acclaimed microbiologist from East Anglia. But right now, making a repeat appearance, Sam Fazeli on pharmacology, of course, working with Bloomberg Intelligence. Dr. Fazeli, what have you learned in the last 24 hours about the miracle of the Pfizer vaccine?
Good morning, Tom, and again, a privilege to be joining you today. So I think we've thought a little bit more about the minutiae of what this 90% reduction potentially means. And but of course, as you keep thinking about it, you come up with questions that you still want answers to. Yep. And that list keeps growing.
It is a vaccine. It is not bacterial. We'll talk to Paul Hunter with his acclaimed work in microbiology. In making a vaccine, Sam, do you just assume failure on the path to success, or can Pfizer launch something that works day one?
Well, I think you have to assume that in most clinical trials, especially when you're using a completely new technology and dealing with a virus that we've never been able to or never have tried to get under control. So I think this 90% was an amazing starting point. So I'm really happy that we're starting from this point and not 50% or 60%.
Sam, what is the one thing that you want to know about this trial? So everyone's very positive. I know you're quite positive. And, is this a matter of timing? Is it the distribution of it? What are the questions still that we need to ask ourselves?
Yeah, I mean, I hope if we can get to the moon and back, we can get this thing distributed. I know it's not easy, but we have to. But so if you ask me for one question, I'd like to know how durable the immune protection is. That's what I really want to know.
How long until we find out?
Unfortunately, you just have to wait as the time ticks by. So I think it's 6 months to a year, we would know whether this vaccine and these people who've been vaccinated continue to be protected against the infection.
Sam Fazeli, thank you so much. Of course, out of Cardiff and the University of London. Now also out of Cardiff and, of course, truly acclaimed in microbiology across the United Kingdom with Norwich Medical and the University of East Anglia. Paul Hunter joins us right now. Paul, I want to talk about the great fear that we saw yesterday in the United States, buried in the election news, which is nosocomial infections. This, folks, is the idea that you go in the hospital and you get sick because you're with other sick people. Paul Hunter, is it legitimate across the viruses? Can we get nosocomial illness?
Oh, absolutely. Nosocomial illness is a risk for many infections, and particularly in children and pediatric wards at certain times of the year when there's a lot of respiratory syncytial virus around, then then that does spread quite easily between children. And you know, at that times of year, we try and cohort, what we call cohort patients, where people with the infection are nursed separately, hopefully on separate wards, to other patients who don't have the infection because of that risk, certainly.
Paul, brief us on the season of the year. If it's water-based like cholera, it's a more heat-based illness. There's the meningitises, and I think of October and November of any given year. Do you buy the idea of a weather shift in this terrible virus?
Absolutely, and I think we've already begin to have seen that. The first year for any new emergent infectious disease is always not typical because there's just so many people who are susceptible. But if you look at other related viruses, there are two other beta coronaviruses that jumped into humans probably many decades ago, and they tend to cause their problems November, December, January, February, occasionally into March, but not often. And so you would expect, as we build up immunity in the population, that this infection will spread more readily during the winter, primarily because people spend more time indoors. And I don't think it's necessarily the weather per se, it's whether it's cold enough or rainy enough that you actually congregate indoors rather than congregate outdoors.
Professor, going back to the vaccine, how quickly do you think we'll have it? And will people take it? Is it a kind of vaccine that you have to have every year? Or would you need also a top-up every 6 months, depending on actually how long you're protected for?
Well, we don't know how long you're protected with the virus, with the vaccine at the moment. With the virus, with natural infection, some people have been getting infected after 1 or 2 months. I suspect with the vaccine, immunity will last longer than that. I hope and expect it will last about a year or two, maybe even longer. We will have to wait and see. And so I do expect that it's likely that we will be having to have this vaccine every year, as we do for influenza vaccine. But it may well be that once we get there that we find, well, actually, it's not necessary every year. We can do it every 5 years or whatever. But we won't really know that for at least another year or so.
How long until it's distributed widely, Professor? Are we too optimistic about the ability to, once we have the formula, to make it refrigerated and send it out?
Yeah, I think our Deputy Chief Medical Officer, Jonathan Van Tam, yesterday said he hoped that we would have some vaccine available before the end of December. But I think realistically, if everything goes okay and it passes the regulators' requirements, essentially we'll be looking to scale up the vaccine early in the new year. But this is going to be a huge undertaking to vaccinate everybody who's going to have this, and so we'll be vaccinating people for several months as we move into next year.
Professor Hunter, we learned yesterday of Celsius and Fahrenheit, -74 degrees, and Fahrenheit, -94 degrees is the transfer of the vaccine. Maybe it's like liquid nitrogen and all that from our childhoods. Is that doable across our society? Can we move this precious cargo around ice cold?
Well, we certainly can do that because we already are moving large amounts of other materials around in those sorts of temperatures. I think the difficulty is how far into the population you're able to distribute that, and it's quite possible with this vaccine that what will happen is that we have bigger centres, so more central centres that people go to, rather than just nipping to the GP surgery or their family doctor's surgery to have the vaccine. So, because it would be difficult to ensure the cold chain in small practices. So maybe bigger hubs for vaccination, and that would be achievable and relatively easily manageable.
Professor Hunter, when you look at some of the great strides, do we sometimes forget the treatments available? Is it much safer? And I'd caution everyone, of course, to wear masks and be socially distant. But is it much safer to catch it now than it was back in March?
Undoubtedly, and if you look at the death rates, they do seem to be lower now than they were in the autumn. And if you look at people, there's a UK, an English study on intensive care units, and if you go onto an intensive care unit now and you are under 70, you are about 40% less likely to die than you would have done if you'd gone onto those same units back in April. So there has been a major improvement in survival.
Thank you so much for joining us. Paul, Professor, finish?
Yeah, I was saying, and much of that is because of a drug called dexamethasone, which if it's given at the right time, does reduce death rate quite substantially.
Paul Hunter, thank you, professor in medicine at Norwich Medical School, University of East Anglia. Now let's get straight to the Bloomberg First Word News. Here's Ritika Gupta. Hi, Ritika.
Hi, Francine. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has given President Trump cover for challenging election returns.
Within his right.
The president has claimed there was a widespread voter fraud. So far, those claims have been unsubstantiated. A warning from the Federal Reserve on the coronavirus. The Fed says asset prices in key markets could still take a hit if the pandemic's economic impact gets worse. A Fed report pointed out signs of weakness in the commercial real estate market. U.S. regulators could give the Boeing 737 MAX the okay to resume commercial service as soon as next week. The FAA is finalizing their review of fixes to the aircraft. Boeing's best-selling jet has been grounded since March of 2019 following 2 fatal crashes. And in Peru, President Martin Vizcarra has been surprisingly booted from office. The country's Congress overwhelmingly voted to impeach him over allegations of corruption. Vizcarra says he won't challenge the vote through legal channels. The head of the Peruvian Congress will become the interim president. Peru has been recovering from one of the world's deepest recessions. Global news 24 hours a day on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg. Francie and Tom.
Ritika, thanks so much. Thank you for joining Bloomberg Television and Bloomberg Surveillance. We do economics, finance, investment, and boy, are we doing way too much politics right now. All of that folds in to the hydrocarbon market. Fadi Birol will join us from IEA here on oil. A real mystery here of the tendency of oil off of supply and the mystery of global demand. Red and green on the screen right now. Futures at -12. This is Bloomberg. Good morning.
I'm David Weston. Bloomberg Television is reinventing one of the most iconic brands in financial television for a new audience. Join me to see the news program for the clever investor. This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week.
The Boston Symphony Orchestra presents BSO at Home. While you stay inside, enjoy a curated collection of archived concerts and behind-the-scenes stories from BSO musicians. BSO Homeschool provides lessons for music lovers of all ages. New performances and messages from musicians are added regularly. Enjoy these selections and much more at bso.org/at-home.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance. Tom and Francine from London and New York. Now, since we found out about Biden administration on Saturday, Tom, there are a number of things that will change in the U.S. One is a commitment to climate change. The other is, of course, energy security and what that means for the U.S. To talk now about demand, to talk about Biden presidency, and, of course, about renewables, we're delighted to be joined by Fatih Birol, the IEA Executive Director. Fatih, as always, thank you so much for joining us. What does a Biden administration mean for energy consumption in the U.S.? What does it mean for climate change and renewables?
What we read and what we see is that the next administration will put a strong emphasis on climate change. This will mean, in turn, pushing renewables, especially solar and wind, strongly, and also other clean energy technologies, ranging from carbon capture and storage to nuclear power. And I would expect that some regulations in terms of energy efficiency, methane emissions will be put in place in order to reduce U.S. emissions and as such the global emissions. But the big push I would expect, first of all, will come in the area of renewable energies, solar and wind, for which U.S. has a great potential similar to oil and gas.
But Fatih, when you look at renewable power, how dependent is it on the price of fossil fuels? So how dependent is it on the price of oil? Is it independent? So does the trend go no matter what? Or do we need to look at global demand, oil demand, the vaccine, to give us an indication of oil and therefore renewables?
I think the dependency between the oil prices and the renewables are not as strong as it was a few years ago. Renewables have their own dynamics now. For example, solar power today is the cheapest source of electricity generation in most parts of the world. It is the reason I have crowned solar as the new king of global electricity markets. If you look at just this year, Francine, just 2020, about half of the power plants built in the world are solar. Other 50%, everything else put together, coal, gas, nuclear, wind, 50%, solar alone 50%. Therefore, they are already themselves cost effective. And in the United States, there is already a strong potential, strong growth, but with the next administration's, new administration's policies, this can be even higher.
Now, Fatih, does the Pfizer vaccine that we heard about yesterday change your outlook for 2021 oil demand?
Now, first of all, I should tell you that the day after tomorrow, we are releasing our oil market report, and I see two important trends and one question mark. One important trend is the second wave we are seeing in Europe and elsewhere in terms of the coronavirus second wave. The lockdown measures and in other countries as well puts downward pressure, further downward pressure on the demand, oil demand. Second, in some countries, production is increasing, coming from Libya and United States as well after the hurricanes are over. both of them putting higher production, lower demand will give more pressure, downward pressure on the prices. If vaccine really proves to be feasible, sustainable, and it can be applied around the world, we may well see it gives a boost to oil demand, including the bleeding aviation sector. But if it proves to be a sustainable solution.
Fatih, I want to go to your engineering degree at Technical University of Istanbul. This is a few years ago. Fatih, can you explain to our worldwide audience how Turkey survives with this gross devaluation and their needs of oil? How does Turkey handle devaluation of the lira and oil?
So I left my home country almost 4 decades ago, but of course follow the developments there. My family is there, my friends are there. But what I see is that Turkey is going through very difficult times in terms of its economy, devaluation of the lira, and as such, the Turkey's current deficit is becoming a major issue for the country. And as we all know, about 90% of the Turkish energy is met by energy imports, oil and gas. So therefore, it's a major challenge for the country in this difficult context.
Mr. Birol, thank you so much. Greatly appreciated this morning. The IEA Executive Director on his Turkey and also, of course, global supply and demand. One thing I can look at is a 10-year yield. Well, it's getting out near that 1% level. We're not back to yesterday's peak, but 0.94% on the 10-year yield. We do politics, and of course, we continue with the impact of the pandemic. We've gotten huge value over recent months from the Lieutenant Governor of New York State. Kathy Hochul is out of Buffalo, and she is living the actual what do we do about this pandemic in the 7 o'clock hour. Futures red and green on the screen. Dow futures green, SPX, and -18. This is Bloomberg.
really a reminder, isn't it, just how sensitive the markets are to any commentary about trade. We did see some pressure on the yuan, we did see some pressure on the futures. That is now being reversed.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance. I'm Rishika Gupta with your Bloomberg Business Flash. The European Union is set to issue a formal antitrust complaint today against Amazon. Bloomberg's learned the EU suspects the company misuses data it gathers on sales by rivals on its online platform. The move would escalate a probe into Amazon's role as both direct retailer and as a host to other online stores. Billionaire Ray Dalio's Bridgewater Associates is doing better in China than in the rest of the world. Bloomberg's learned that Bridgewater has raised $136 million for its second China fund. Its all-weather China strategy fund posted a 22% annualized return for its first 22 months. Meanwhile, Bridgewater's flagship Pure Alpha 2 fund fell almost 19% for the year through November the 5th. And the National Basketball Association will start its next season on December 22nd. That'll be less than 3 months after the last one ended. The NBA and its players' union agreed on a shortened 72-game season. And that's your latest Bloomberg Business Flash. Tom Francine.
Thank you so much, Ritika. Look at the data. Look at what the markets are doing. After 2 days of euphoria, we see, of course, that market easing off a little bit. Now, the focus, of course, is on some of the havens. If you look also at gold, 1,870, and you can see European stocks, Tom, gaining some 0.3%.
Well, we see a lot there, and of course with the data today after the huge day yesterday, truly an historic day yesterday with value just trounced. What a shift it was. I did a lot of mathematics on how much was made up, and we made up about a standard deviation. We are by no means back to pre-pandemic trend on value. Again, 105.44 gets my attention. This is well-timed. Yes, we will address climate change with Jeffrey Sachs of the Earth Institute, Columbia University, but much, much more. No one was more out front on the challenges of the middle class in America. We'll talk to Jeff Sachs about the 4 years forward. Stay with us on politics, on the markets. This is Bloomberg. Good morning. But this morning, it was far-fetched, that spectacular news on a vaccine, that it would lift J.P. Morgan shares 15%, that Dow futures would, well, for a brief shining second print, 30,000, but it happened. Stock stabilized this morning, the dollar too. The Attorney General will not wait for voter certification. Department of Justice will search for irregularities that are not specious, speculative, fanciful, or far-fetched. And if it's Monday, well, fire the Secretary of Defense, who will exit the White House this Tuesday. Good morning, everyone. Bloomberg Surveillance. Tom Keene in New York, Francine Lacroix in London. Love what we did last hour, Francine, on the pandemic with the microbiologist from East Anglia and with our wonderful Sam Fazeli. But it's also about this election. And for the American audience, Francine, they wake up to an attorney general with something on his mind.
Yeah, and there's, 2 or 3 questions, Tom, that we need to ask ourselves. First of all, if this is a strategy by the Republican Party, to what end? Is it about the Senate in Georgia? Is it about something else? Is it because, President Trump, once out of office, will still remain kingmaker for the Republican Party? And then, of course, we need to look at what that means for the transition period and how difficult that will be for Joe Biden as he gets ready to take control.
And still counting votes in those key states. I noticed Arizona, Mr. Trump actually very, very teensweens narrowed the gap yesterday. They're still counting the people counting the votes, and also those worried about are the votes legal or illegal. Let's get a briefing. Our first word news in New York City. Here's Ritika Gupta.
Morning, Tom, Francine. President Trump's Attorney General William Barr will let the Justice Department investigate potential voting irregularities in the presidential election. But Barr has acknowledged there is no conclusive evidence, and he warned against what he called far-fetched claims. After Barr announced a new policy, the head of the department's election crimes branch resigned. The U.S. is set to hit record hospitalizations for the coronavirus this week. Numbers are soaring in Midwest states such as Illinois and Michigan. Meanwhile, in Texas, the city of El Paso has more people hospitalized with the virus than at 29 states. And starting today, the European Union will impose tariffs on $4 billion of U.S. goods. It's a tit-for-tat escalation of a fight over illegal aid to aircraft manufacturers Boeing and Airbus. The EU says it will drop the tariffs if the US removes duties imposed on the EU products last year. In the UK, the House of Lords rejected government plans to break international law over Brexit. They voted to remove the most controversial parts of the internal market bill. Prime Minister Boris Johnson immediately vowed to push ahead with the legislation. It gives ministers the power to rewrite parts of the Brexit deal Johnson signed with the EU. Global news 24 hours a day on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg. Tom, Francine.
Ritika, thank you. Off the historic moment yesterday, a churning to the market, red and green on the screen. I won't bother you there. 25.45 on the VIX. I note the 10-year yield 0.94%, really elevated, not out to highs yesterday, but nevertheless, and to be noted, oil churning higher. And I guess I've got to note more than anything, Japanese yen from that 103, 104, and now a 105.48 on Japanese yen. That's a weaker Japanese yen, much more so against dollar and even euro. Francine?
Tom, that global rally in stocks faltered, and it's really the only story in town. Now, why it faltered, possibly profit-taking, partly part of the question from the vaccine. I think we'll have to see exactly how it develops, and the focus also is on stimulus that could be much smaller than expected in the U.S. What I can tell you is treasuries are adding to Monday's decline. The dollar's pretty much flat, and European stocks gain some 0.3%.
It gains note when there is something from the Attorney General at 8 p.m. at night that was breaking news late into the evening in America. But even of greater note is who's quitting. Richard Pilger resigned immediately from the Department of Justice. He's out of Notre Dame, a 28-year veteran of DOJ. He is expert on voter extortion, bribery, and even involved in Jack Abramoff scandal of years ago. Our Kevin Cirilli picks up the pieces this morning, our chief Department of Justice correspondent. Kevin, was this a surprise to see the Attorney General essentially do what the president asked?
It's definitely notable. Is it a surprise based on what we've seen over the past couple of years? I think the short answer is no. Yesterday, the president also firing via tweet his defense secretary, Mark Esper. In addition to that, Vice President Mike Pence is set to go on vacation in Florida over the next couple of days. But I can tell you that yesterday I spoke with a source at the State Department who told me essentially that they have been continuing to work on their transition binders for several weeks. Now, this is protocol, but I think it's notable in the sense that even as this politicization of the transition process, to put it mildly, is ongoing, the transition of power from a transitional agency standpoint is still being conducted.
Is the president going to have binders full of people quitting?
You know, I think that's a really great point, and it's a really great question, but I just don't know. I can tell you that based upon the sources that I talked to, Tom, they're all looking for jobs, and they are, and as is normal at the end of a term. And I spoke with several sources over the past couple of days who work in the administration who are job hunting, and so that I think it feels that part of this process feels normal. But obviously the formalities of a transition of power and a concession speech and the like, that's been thrown out the window.
Kevin, what exactly are you looking out for in the next couple of days? I know there's in the minutia, there are people in jobs that will make the transition difficult. There are people in the Republican Party that give us a good indication of what the strategy is. Who are the people and the things that you're watching out for?
Three things. First and foremost, I think it's incredibly important to put an analytical take on what we're watching over the past 4 days, especially in the short term. And that is that there's a political nature to what Republicans are jockeying for on January 5th, and that is a runoff election in Georgia. And the stake of control of the Senate is at stake. And so as a result of that, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, as well as other Republicans, want to make sure that there is a big turnout amongst conservatives in Georgia. Secondly, today, President-elect Joe Biden, he's going to be focusing on health care, the Affordable Care Act. The Supreme Court takes that up. That is a massive, massive policy issue that impacts Americans. Biden is putting his focus on that today. And then thirdly, this is the fiscal stimulus, especially in the lame duck portion of this specific part of what we've gone on. Yesterday, the Pfizer news, the stock market, investors watching this. But Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell came out yesterday and said that the positive developments on the vaccination front are indicative to him that a smaller fiscal stimulus deal ought to be passed because this vaccine is on the way. So those are the three things on my radar.
Kevin, how are the American people living through this? Do you have any insight into how many people actually believe that there's there was funny business going on with the election?
Look, it's too early to have the polls that have come out on this. I think it's a very serious question that you just raised. And I would note that there were close to 70 million Americans who cast their ballot for President Trump. And obviously, President-elect Joe Biden had more than that. So this, in terms of what this means, it's too early to tell. That's all I've got on that front.
Kevin, I got to put the legal language in context here to help our audience worldwide and across this nation. And folks, this fancy language from the Attorney General, I'm going to say that the Eagles' Super Bowl chances are fanciful and far-fetched. What does that language mean? Seriously, Kevin, what is that language? Specious and far-fetched. Translate.
Well, I think what it means is just that, and I would disagree with the comparison that you made to the Eagles, but I'll stay focused and stoic, and I will come forward and say that I think you've seen a stark contrast in terms of how some Republicans, this has been a dividing issue. I mean, to get back to Francine's point and your point, I mean, this is a dividing issue. Governor Larry Hogan, Republican Maryland, Senator Mitt Romney, Republican Utah, Gary Cohn have all come out and congratulated the president-elect. But there are other Republicans, Senator Ted Cruz, who have said, you know, this hasn't been certified.
Oh, come on, Kevin, stop. It's the federal government usurping state prerogatives, state power. Does a guy like you just assume the courts are going to intervene at some point and say no?
No, but I think it's important to look at this from an analytical standpoint as a reporter, which is to look, why are people behaving the way they are? And so the reason is a Georgia election, as well as a 2022 midterms, And then finally, the 2024 race for the Republican primary.
You're already out to 2024?
I'm just telling you what I'm reporting what I'm hearing, which is my job.
Okay, I guess it is. Kevin Cirilli, thank you so much. Bloomberg Chief Washington Correspondent will not be with us for the next 30 days, vacationing in Florida with the Vice President. Coming up later, we got red and green on the screen, futures a -15, a timely interview, the resignation of the Secretary of Defense. That's important. There was true angst at the Pentagon yesterday with important meetings. Stavridis joins us, of course, the former NATO Supreme Commander. That in the 10 o'clock hour. This is Bloomberg. Good morning.
It came in better than expected, not only in terms of job creation, but also a sharp fall in the unemployment rate consistent with higher labor force participation. That's really good news.
Overall, the gain was solid, but even while this is a very robust pace of job gains, it's a lot slower than it has been in the summer months.
Great that we saw the job gains we did, but they still are diminished from what they were, of course, back in April and May. And the scarring, the sort of wounds that were created by COVID are beginning to fester.
I would caution people to look at the top line number because I don't think it tells the entire story. Employment relative to population is still well below where we were pre-crisis, and that's because I think that we're going to have some lasting damage.
Depending on what you look at, jobs creation or the unemployment rate, you have different views as to whether the improvement in the labor force is keeping up or slowing down.
We explore the trends, investments, and competition of the European ETF industry. Join us on Bloomberg ETF IQ Europe.
Good morning, everyone. Bloomberg Surveillance. Francine Lacroix in London. I'm Tom Keene in New York. We're thrilled you could join us on the markets. Yes, they're churning after the extraordinary move yesterday, but on so much more, including our politics of the nation. Right now, the gentleman who in books that were laughed at over a decade ago said, "Watch it, America. You're becoming dumber. You're becoming poorer." No one, and I mean no one, nailed it like Jeffrey Sachs. Liberal, the conservatives have to read him because, unfortunately, he can be out front, and the liberals, of course, adore him, with Columbia University and their Earth Institute. Professor Sachs, we're going to get to climate change here at the bottom of the hour. I need to talk to you right now about the liberal mandate that we saw in this election in an increasingly conservative manner. How do liberals apply theory in a deeply divisive America?
People need help in this country. We have gone through year after year of solving no problems, but people have very practical problems. People need work. They need social support. They need their kids to be educated. They need health care. We need to stop the unbelievable madness of this president and this Republican Party that is completely out of control.
Okay, well, let's
actually solve some problems.
Okay, but Jeff Sachs, let's assume President Trump is history. We don't know that yet with all the contention, but let's assume he moves on. Let's talk about the Republican Party and how the last of the old guard, Joe Biden of Delaware, have to deal with a clear liberal mandate, but also deal with a nation that does not agree with that mandate. How does President Biden affect that?
I think that instead of having legislation sprung on the public and somehow pushed through, or executive orders, President Biden will have to do what he does well, which is explain to the American people how certain things can help them and why we should adopt this. I believe that the American people are much, much less divided than the political system makes it appear. People in red states as well as blue states, as Biden has always emphasized, need practical day-to-day solutions. And our country, you know, we've solved nothing for well over a decade now in terms of any structural issues, whether it's the infrastructure, whether it's the growing climate disasters, whether it's the healthcare crisis, which is actually a multiple crisis of people who can't afford healthcare, people who don't have healthcare. We obviously couldn't solve this pandemic for a moment, even to think straight, and now we have 244,000 dead, and the number dead keep rising by 1,000 a day. This is a kind of collective breakdown of basic governance. So one has to ask the question, are people interested in having their real life family problems solved? And I believe the answer is yes. And for that, we're going to need to have governance that addresses the problems rather than looks at the partisan vote each time. And maybe it's going to happen. It hasn't happened for 10 years, but maybe it can happen now. Biden actually is temperamentally and by experience exactly the person who could pull that off.
But we haven't seen it so far, Jeffrey Sachs. So what makes you optimistic that we will?
Well, I think, first of all, Biden won despite the delusional and really completely unprecedented behavior. Of course, that's redundant when you are talking about Trump. But the delusional behavior of this man, Biden, won. Biden carried states that need help. Biden has a plan, Professor by the way. And just let me emphasize that people are concerned about jobs, people are concerned about health care, and there are actually very practical approaches to those issues.
But the Republican Party is supporting the president in his claim against Joe Biden. What does that tell you?
Well, it tells me that people like Mitch McConnell, Ted Cruz, and Lindsey Graham are more interested in destroying anything they can than in solving problems. But a good president is going to be able to press the case with the American people. And if the president is effective, a president can actually roll over a majority leader of the Senate. I'm sorry to say it, but Obama didn't know how to do it. I think Biden will be better at doing it.
Let me give you one, this is a really interesting conversation. Professor Sachs, let me give you one immediate application, which was in your acclaimed books on the state of American malaise, and that is our child care policy. All of a sudden, we're living it in this pandemic. What would be appropriate legislation to see out of Biden and out of McConnell to relieve the child care burden from sea to shining sea?
Well, there's one thing that Trump held up, and it's a more of a financial issue, which is that our states and cities, of course, are cutting services right now, exactly the kinds of social services that families need to be able to address the problems of kids at home or kids that need to be online at school. And we absolutely have to get funding to state and city governments. Trump precisely would not do that because many cities are democratic cities. It's a madness, actually. I mean, it's really a sickness. And because of that, we have in my city, in New York City, our city, and elsewhere, frontline workers, social workers, teachers, people that are absolutely vital being let go because of these budgets. Now, that's Hoover economics. You don't make massive cuts like that at the depths of a temporary downturn. It's horrible, but Trump blocked any practical solution. So I believe that Biden will reach out to governors and mayors, and they will say to Mr. McConnell, that we really need something right now. And it will happen because it's crying out to happen. We forget what it's like to have a president who is not really mentally disordered, but we will have one soon who is absolutely normal.
Well, we're going to come back with Jeffrey Sachs and talk about climate change, his commitment to the Earth Institute, and, of course, hugely controversial wrapped around the Paris Accord. Jeffrey Sachs of Columbia University with us. A mixed market here. It's really odd. I mean, the futures negative 13. Dow futures go the other way, up 167. Of course, a huge move off the Pfizer vaccine announcement yesterday, and I must say also, even before that, off the electoral results that we have seen, and certainly the treatment of that. On the pandemic, a conversation. We'll do this in the 7 o'clock hour. Kathy Hope